on circular reasoning. 56 for if the effect of marginal increases or decreases of capital inputs upon output has to be measured, this can only be done in money terms, given the heterogeneous nature of so-called capital goods. But this process of pricing or valuation of capital inputs presupposes a rate of return on the plant and equipment in question, of which the latter value is the capitalization, that is, one has to assume a rate of interest in order to demonstrate how this equilibrium rate of return is determined. 57 The way out, obviously, is to look for a common substance in all the capital goods, independent of money, that is to return to socially necessary labor as the measure-able substance of the value of all commodities. 55. Ibid. Chapter 10. 56. Joan Robinson, The Accumulation of Capital, London, 1956. Piero Sraffa, Production of Commodities by Means of Commodities, Cambridge, 1960. 57. Maurice Dobb, The Sraffa System in the Critique of the Neoclassical Theory of Distribution, reprinted in E. K. Hunt and Jesse G. Swartz, ed. A Critique of Economic Theory, Harmondsworth, 1972, page .207. One should note, however, that, to use the Schumpeterian jargon, Dobb thus only justifies the use of labor as a numeraire, a unit of account, in a typically neo-Ricardian way, and not at all on the basis of the Marxist labor theory of value e. 60 Introduction 8. Marx's theory of accumulation of capital is thus, by definition, value looking for accretion, for surplus value. But if capital produces surplus value also produces additional capital. Under capitalism, economic growth therefore appears in the form of accumulation of capital. The basic drive of the capitalist mode of production is the drive to accumulate capital. This is not so because of some mysterious and tautological, accumulative passion, or inclination on the part of capitalists. It is essentially explained by competition, that is by the phenomenon of various capitals. Without competition, Marx states categorically, the driving fire of growth would become extinguished. 58 Totally monopolized capital, a single world trust, would essentially be stagnating capital. That competition is combined with the trend to replace labor by machinery is a driving force for capital accumulation and economic growth under capitalism. If the extension of output maintained the given relationship between inputs of living labor and inputs of dead labor, machinery and raw materials, it would rapidly reach both a physical limit, the total available manpower, and hence a profit limit. Under conditions of permanent full employment, wages would tend to increase and erode profits to the point where capital accumulation and economic growth would gradually disappear. Under capitalism, however, economic growth is not neutral with respect to the relationship between living and dead labor inputs, between variable and constant capital. It is heavily loaded in favor of an expansion of labor-saving devices. Indeed, a permanent tendency to increase the social productivity of labor is the main civilizing byproduct of capital accumulation, the main objective service which capitalism has rendered mankind. Capital accumulation takes on the primary form of an increase in the value of plant and equipment, as well as of the stock of raw materials available in industrialized capitalist countries. On a long-term basis, this accumulation is as impressive as Marx could have imagined. The value of all accumulated private non-farm producer durables multiplied more than tenfold in constant dollars between 1900 and 1965 in the USA, and this estimate is certainly undervalued as it is based upon official records biased for reasons of tax evasion. S8. Karl Marx, Capital, Volume 3, page 254. Introduction 61 Capital accumulation is, of course, distinct from the behavior of pre-capitalist ruling classes. If all surplus value were to be consumed in the form of luxury goods, no capital accumulation would take place at all. Capital would then be maintained at the level it had already reached. This special, limiting case was indeed presented by Marx under the name of simple reproduction, for purely analytical reasons. It does not, of course, correspond to any real stage or situation of a normally functioning capitalist mode of production. 59 As we pointed out, what characterizes capitalism is precisely the compulsion to accumulate, that is, enlarged reproduction. Enlarged reproduction presupposes that not all surplus value produced by productive labor, and appropriated by the capitalist class, is unproductively consumed. Part of it is transformed into luxury goods and disappears from the process of reproduction. Part of it is transformed into additional capital by being used to buy additional plant and equipment, additional raw materials and additional labor power. This, then, is the process of accumulation of capital, the transformation of surplus value into additional capital, which can produce new increments of surplus value, leading to new increments of capital. The movement develops in the form of a spiral, as Simon de Sismondi, one of the early romantic critics of capitalism, whom Marx quotes approvingly on this question, already understood. The fact that capital accumulation is possible only because part of the surplus value appropriated by the capitalist class is not socially squandered in luxury goods constitutes the starting point for the so-called abstinence theory, more accurately, justification, of profits and capitalist exploitation. 60 Historically, there is not an atom of evidence for the assumption that capital somehow grew out of the frugal habits of some members of the community, as opposed to the improvidence of others, each of them having equal access to resources that were initially com. 59. One could say that it corresponds to a border case of stagnation in a given phase of the trade cycle. 60. Even Schumpeter still largely defended this abstinence theory of profit, although giving it a less vulgar character than in the case of senior. The capitalist exchanges a fund against a flow. The abstinence for which he is being paid enters into the accumulation of the fund. There is no additional payment for refraining from consuming it even in cases in which this would be physically possible. History of Economic Analysis, page 661. See also Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy, page 16. 62 Introduction Parable. On the contrary, all historical evidence confirms that the sudden appearance of large amounts of capital, in the form of a stock of precious metals and other treasure, in a society previously confined almost exclusively to natural economy, to the output of goods possessing only use value, was the result not of frugality and thrift, but of large-scale piracy, robbery, violence, theft, enslavement of men and trade in slaves. The history of the origins of West European usury and merchant capital between the 10th and the 13th centuries, from the piracy in the Mediterranean through the plundering of Byzantium by the Fourth Crusade to the regular plundering razzias into the Slav territories of Central and Eastern Europe, is very eloquent in this respect. What is unconfirmed by history is even more absurd in the light of contemporary economic analysis. Nobody could seriously argue that Messrs. Rockefeller, Morgan and Mellon have to be compensated for their virtue in not squandering tens of billions of dollars on additional yachts, mansions and private jets, the vulgar version of the abstinence theory. But its more sophisticated version, namely the idea that the profits of the owners of capital are just the way in which their fund is transformed into the flow of long-term capital investment, provides a nice piece of circular reasoning. For whence does the fund originate, if not precisely from the flow, that is to say, what else is capital if not accumulated profits? To deny that profits originate in the process of production flies in the face of all scientific as well as practical observation of what goes on in a capitalist economy. Once we understand this, there is no room left for any abstinence theory of profit, only for a subtraction one. The process of capital accumulation is viewed by Marx in Capital at two different and successive levels of abstraction. In Volume 1, in the framework of capital in general, he examines it essentially in the light of what occurs in and flows from the exchange between wage labor and capital. In Volume 3, he examines capital accumulation, economic growth under capitalism, in the light of what occurs in the sphere of many capitals, that is of capitalist competition. I shall therefore leave to the introduction to Volume 3 an examination of the main criticisms made of Marx by those who question the validity of the laws of motion of capital accumulation set out in that volume. Here, I shall limit myself to examining the basic effects of capital accumulation on wage labor. Introduction 63. Unlike many of his contemporaries, including some of the stern-est non-Marxist critics of capitalism, Marx did not consider that capital accumulation had a simple and unequivocally detrimental effect upon the situation of wage labor. Marx had studied the movement of real wages during the trade cycle, and the fact that wages were at their highest level when capital accumulation was progressing at the quickest pace by no means escaped him. 61. But, once again, he tried to go beyond such evident facts to study the fundamental modifications in value terms which capital accumulation would exercise upon labor. It thus became his contention that the very way in which capital accumulation proceeds, the very motive force of capitalist progress, the development of fixed capital, of machinery, contains a powerful dynamic to reduce the value of labor power. For as this value is the equivalent of the value of a given quantity of consumer goods, supposed to be necessary to restore the capacity of a worker to produce at a given level of intensity, a decrease in the value of these consumer goods resulting from an increase in the productivity of labor in the consumer goods industry leads to a decrease in the value of labor power, all other things remaining equal. This argument implies neither any tendency to a decrease in real wages, on the contrary, it is based upon the assumption of stable real wages in the short and medium term, nor any trend towards growing absolute misery of the working class. We shall deal with this theory falsely attributed to Marx in the next section of this introduction. But it does imply that the favorable results of the increase in productivity of labor end by falling, to a large extent, into the hands of the capitalist class, by transforming themselves into supplementary, relative surplus value, provided that the long-term trend of the industrial reserve army of labor is either stable or increasing. On a world scale, this has certainly been true for as long as capitalism has existed. As Marx predicted, capitalism spread not only by creating new jobs but also by creating new unemployed, by destroying employment of previous wage earners, and especially of previously self-employed small farmers and handicraftsmen. But to calculate a world average value of labor power is of course a meaningless abstraction. Indeed, ever since industrial capitalism 61. Karl Marx, Wages, Price and Profit, in Selected Works in One Volume, London, 1970, pp. 220-21. 64 Introduction in the West started to swamp the rest of the world with its cheap, mass-produced commodities, and at the latest since the 1870s, a divergent trend has appeared in the world economy. A long-term decline of the reserve army of labor in Western Europe, as a result of exports of both emigrants and commodities, and a rise in the reserve army of labor in the underdeveloped countries. This latter process included, of course, the transformation of masses of pre-capitalist farmers, cattle raisers and artisans into uprooted, marginalized, vagrants, migrant seasonal laborers, and forced laborers, following a pattern similar to what had happened a few centuries earlier in Western Europe. The dynamics of capital accumulation on a world scale, have therefore to be seen as those of an organic whole, and not as the simple sum of capital accumulation processes in distinct countries. The operation of the world market is a gigantic siphon to transfer value from the south to the north of our planet, from the countries with lower to the countries with higher productivity of labor, lies at the very root of the imperialist system. While the debate on the theoretical explanation of this phenomenon is still in its initial stages, 62 it is important to note that the phenomenon itself is based upon uneven movements, uneven mobility, of capital and labor, and introduces all those dimensions into the analysis of capitalism which Marx reserved for the never-written volumes 4, 5 and 6 in the original plan of capital. The accumulation of capital is the accumulation of wealth in the form of commodities of value. Value production becomes a goal in itself. Work is degraded to the level of a means by which to receive money incomes. One of the most striking and most modern parts of capital is that which examines the inhuman consequences of capital accumulation for the workers and for work itself. Marx himself added to the second German edition of Volume 1 the note 62. See, among other writings, Samir Amin, L. Accumulate 1 foot on Die Richelle Mondiale, Paris, 1970. Arguri Emanuel, Unequal Exchange, including a discussion with Charles Bettelheim, London, 1972. Christian Pauwat, L.J. Économie Mondiale Capitaliste, Paris, 1971. And the discussion of these books by Ernest Mandel in Late Capitalism, London, 1975. Interestingly enough, W. Arthur Lewis, in his Development with Unlimited Supplies of Labor, Manchester School of Economic and Social Studies, VO1. 22, May 1954, tries to show that stepped-up capital accumulation implies a large industrial reserve army, but he limits this case exclusively to initial industrialization and does not admit Marx's assumption of permanent reconstitution of this reserve army through the mechanization process. Introduction 6s that, under capitalism, labor power not only becomes a commodity for the capitalist but also receives this form for the worker himself, implying that this degradation of work is both objectively and subjectively the fate of the industrial proletariat. It took official, political economy a long time, indeed until after the growing revolt of the workers against assembly line speedups, to discover what Marx had anticipated from a thorough understanding of the fundamental mechanisms which govern the capitalist mode of production. Because capital accumulation presupposes production for profit, because it has profit maximization as its very rationale, exact and minute cost calculations entail constant reorganizations of the production process with the single purpose of reducing costs. From the point of view of the single capitalist firm, a worker cannot be seen as a human being endowed with elementary rights, dignity, and needs to develop his personality. He is a cost element, and this cost must be constantly and exclusively measured in money terms, in order to be reduced to the utmost. Even when human relations and psychological considerations are introduced into labor organization, they are all centered in the last analysis upon economies of cost of those overhead costs, called excessive labor turnover, too many work interruptions, absenteeism. K. Closing parenthesis. 63 STRTS, etc. Capitalist economy is thus a gigantic enterprise of dehumanization, of transformation of human beings from goals in themselves into instruments and means for money-making and capital accumulation. It is not the machine, nor any technological compulsion, which inevitably transforms workers and men and women in general into appendices and slaves of monstrous equipment. It is the capitalist principle of profit maximization by individual firms which unleashes this terrifying trend. Other types of technology and other types of machine are perfectly conceivable. Provided that the guiding principle of investment is no longer cost-saving by individual competing firms, but the optimum development of all human beings. 63. The most extreme case is that of globalization of costs in cost-benefit analysis, in which human illness and death are likewise computed in the form of money costs. 66 Introduction 9. Marx's theory of wages. Strangely enough, the idea of an ever-increasing decline in the standard of living of the working class, which has often been falsely attributed to Marx, originated with those economists against whom he maintained a constant barrage of polemics after perfecting his own economic theories. It originated with Malthus and, via Ricardo, reached several socialists of Marx's generation, such as Ferdinand Lassalle. Whether under the guise of a stable wage fund or under the guise of an iron law of wages, it is essentially a population growth theory of wages. Whenever wages rise sufficiently above the physiological minimum, laborers are supposed to have more children, who then in turn create large-scale unemployment and depress wages back to the minimum. The logical shortcomings of this theory are glaring. It examines only what happens on the supply side of labor power. It does not examine at all what happens on the demand side. It presupposes that the potential working population is a linear function of population increase, and that the demographic movement is in turn a linear function of real income. All the intermediate links, like the effects of increases of income not only upon the child mortality rate but also upon birth rates, not to speak of the effects of increases of income and of the organized strength of the working class on the length of the working week, the duration of training and the moment of retiring from the work process, are eliminated from the chain of reasoning, thereby leading to wrong and indeed absurd results. If one compares Marx's own theory of wages to the opinions held by academic economists of his time, one sees at once the step forward which he accomplished. For he points out not only that labor power, having been transformed by capitalism into a commodity, has a value which is objectively determined like the value of all other commodities, but also that the value of labor power has a characteristic distinct from that of all other commodities. To wit, that it is dependent on two elements, the physiological needs and the historical moral needs of the working class. This distinction is closely linked with the peculiar nature of labor power, a commodity inseparable from and integrated with human beings, who are not only endowed with muscles and a stomach, but also with consciousness, nerves, desires, hopes and potential rebelliousness. The physical capacity to work can be. Introduction 67 measured by the calorie inputs that have to compensate losses of energy. But the willingness to work at a given rhythm, a given intensity, under given conditions, with a given equipment of higher and higher value and increasing vulnerability, presupposes a level of consumption which is not simply equivalent to a sum total of calories, but is also a function of what is commonly considered by the working class to be its current, habitual, standard 0F living. 64 Marx notes that these habitual standards differ greatly from country to country, and are generally higher in those countries which have an advanced, developed capitalist industry than in those which are still at pre-industrial levels, or are going through the throes of primitive, industrial capital accumulation. 65 We thus reach an unexpected conclusion. According to this aspect of Marx's work, real wages would actually have to be higher in more advanced capitalist countries, and therefore also in more advanced stages of capitalism, than in less developed countries. This would also imply that they would tend to increase in time, as the level of industrialization increases. On the other hand, we have noted earlier that Marx explained fluctuation of wages during the trade cycle, that is of the price and not of the value of labor power, as being governed essentially by the movements of the industrial reserve army. Real wages would tend to increase in times of boom and full employment and to decline in times of depression and large-scale unemployment. He indicated, however, that there was nothing automatic about this movement, and that the actual class struggle, including trade union action, which he considered indispensable for this very reason, was the instrument through which workers could take advantage of more. 64. Lenin makes the point that with the development of capitalist industry there is a progressive increase in the workers' needs, on the so-called market question, in Collected Works, Volume 1, pp. 106-7. See also Marx. This much, however, can even now be mentioned in passing, namely that the relative restriction on the sphere of the workers' consumption, which is only quantitative, not qualitative, or rather, only qualitative as posited through the quantitative, gives them as consumers an entirely different importance as agents of production from that which they possessed, e.g. in antiquity or in the Middle Ages, or now possess in Asia. Grundrisse, Pelikan Marx Library, page 283. Also Ibid. pp. 186-7, 409, 65. Karl Marx, Wages, Price and Profit, Selected Works in One Volume, page 223, Capital, Volume 1, Chapter 22, see below, pp. 702-5. The most categorical statement in that respect is to be found in Theories of Surplus Value, Part 2, pp. 16-17. The more productive one country is relative to another in the world market, the higher will be its wages, as compared with the other. 68 Introduction Favorable conditions on the labor market, somewhat to increase their wages, whereas the main effect of depression was that it would weaken the resistance of the working class to wage cuts. But Marx stuck to his theory of value with regard to wages. Wages are the prices of the commodity labor power. Like all other prices, they do not fluctuate at random, but around an axis which is the value of that commodity. The movements of wages that are influenced by the ups and downs of the trade cycle explain only short-term fluctuations. These have to be integrated within a wider analysis, explaining the long-term fluctuations of wages in function of the changes in the value of labor power. We can thus formulate Marx's theory of wages as an accumulation of capital wage theory, in opposition to the crude demographic wage theory of the Malthus Ricardo La Salle school. Long-term movements of wages are a function of the accumulation of capital in a fivefold sense. Accumulation of capital implies a decline in value of a given basket of consumer goods included in the given standard of living of the working class, with the given reproduction costs of labor power. In this sense, the development of capitalism tends to depress the value of labor power, all other things remaining equal. Let us repeat. Such a decline in the value of labor power does not imply a decline, but only a stability of real wages. Accumulation of capital implies a decline in the value and an expansion of the output, mass production, of consumer goods previously not included in the reproduction costs of labor power. If objective and subjective conditions are favorable, the working class can force the inclusion of these goods into the accepted minimum standard of living, can expand the moral historical component of the value of labor power, thereby increasing its value. This again does not happen automatically, but essentially as a result of the class struggle. Accumulation of capital will favor the increase in value of labor power if the long-term structural supply of labor power does not strongly exceed demand, or is even below demand. This explains why wages in the USA were from the beginning significantly higher than in Europe, why wages started rising significantly in the latter part of the 19th century in Europe as a result of massive overseas emigration of the reserve army of labor, and why persistent massive unemployment and underemployment in Introduction 69 the underdeveloped countries has implied a tendentially declining value of labor power, often even accompanied by declining real wages in the last 2 decades. Accumulation of capital forms the upper barrier which no increase in the value or the price of labor power can break under capitalism. If and when the increase in the value of labor power implies a strong decline in surplus value, accumulation of capital slows down, large-scale unemployment reappears, and wages are readjusted to a level compatible with capital accumulation. In other words, under capitalism, wages can fall to the point where the historical moral ingredient of the value of labor power completely disappears, where they are actually reduced to the bare physiological minimum. They cannot rise to the point where the historical moral ingredient of the value of labor power wipes out surplus value as the source of capital accumulation. Accumulation of capital implies increased exploitation of the workers, including an increased attrition of labor power, especially through intensification of the production process. But this in turn implies the need for higher consumption just to reproduce labor power even physiologically. So one can say that, in this sense, capitalism increases the value of labor power by making its exploitation more intensive. 66.1 can especially find negative confirmation of this effect of the accumulation of capital on the value of labor power. Once wages decline below a certain level, especially under the effects of wars or reactionary dictatorship, the productive effort of the workers will decline and labor power will not be reconstituted to its full productive capacity, as a result of too high a level of wages. How, then, has it been possible for so many writers, for so long, to have attributed to Marx a theory of absolute impoverishment? 66. We have noted that the value of labor power is an objective category. This implies, among other phenomena, that an important increase in the intensity of the labor process leads to an increase in the value of labor power, all other things remaining equal. A higher expenditure of labor power implies the need for higher consumption, for example, food of higher calorie content, to avoid an erosion of the capacity to work. Rosdolsky, Op.cit. Volume 1, page 331, in this respect draws attention to a distinction made by Otto Bauer between physiological needs, born from the simple life process of the worker, and those needs born from the work process, the second expanding progressively compared with the first in step precisely with the growing intensification of work under capitalism. 70. Introduction of the workers under capitalism, which obviously implied a theory of tendential fall in the value not only of labor power but even of real wages. 67. In the first place because Marx, in his youthful writings, did in fact hold such a theory, for example, in the Communist Manifesto. 68. But this was formulated before he had brought his theoretical understanding of the capitalist mode of production to its final, mature conclusion. It is only in the years 1857-8 that we have the birth of Marx's economic theory in its rounded, consistent form. After he had written a contribution to the critique of political economy in the Grundrisse, there was no longer a trace of any such historical trend towards absolute impoverishment in his economic analysis. In the second place, because so many writers confuse Marx's treatment of the value of labor power, which depends upon the value of the consumer goods the worker buys with his wages, with the category of real wages, determined by the mass of consumer goods his wages buy. Under capitalism, given the constant increase in the productivity of labor, these categories can move in opposite directions. 69-67. C. Among others, Pareto, Op.cit. Page 63. Ludwig von Mises, Le Socialisme, Paris, 1938, page 438. Schumpeter, Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy, pp. 34-8. Karl Popper, The Open Society, Volume 2, pp. 155-8. W. Arthur Lewis, Theory of Economic Growth, London, 1955, page 298. Eric Rolle, A History of Economic Thought, 2nd edition, London, 1954, pp. 284, 293, etc. Two authors who, though they have studied Marx closely and call themselves Marxists, nevertheless repeat the same mistaken view are John Strachey in Contemporary Capitalism, London, 195 greater than, pp. 101-8 and Fritz Sternberg in Der Ellimperialismus, Berlin, 1962, pp. 57-60. More objective are Paul M. Sweezy's account in The Theory of Capitalist Development, Oxford, 1943, pp. 87-92, and J. Steindl's In Maturity and Stagnation in the American Economy, Chapter 14, Oxford, 1952, 68. Manifesto of the Communist Party, The Revolutions of 1848, Pelican Marx Library, 1973, pp. 74-5, 78, 69. Capital, Volume 1, Chapter 17, see below, page 659, contains the key formula in that respect. In this way it is possible, given increasing productivity of labor, for the price of labor power to fall constantly and for this fall to be accompanied by a constant growth in the mass of the workers' means of subsistence, our stress. In the same way, in a famous passage at the end of Wages, Price and Profit, Marx says that, consequently the general tendency of capitalistic production is not to raise but to sink the average standard of wages, or to push the value of labor to its minimum limit, Selected Works in one volume, page 225, and he adds that efforts to increase wages 99 times out of 100 only tend to maintain the value of labor power. This whole argument applies to the trend of the value of labor power, not to that of real wages. Introduction 71 in the third place, because two famous passages in Capital Volume 1 have been consistently misinterpreted. 70 in both these passages Marx does speak about increasing misery and pauperism, and about accumulation of misery. But the context indicates clearly that what he is referring to is the poverty and misery of the surplus population, of the Lazarus layer of the working class, that is, of the unemployed or semi-employed poor. Revealing studies on poverty in rich countries like the United States and Great Britain 71 have strikingly confirmed that the misery of these old age pensioners, unemployed, sick, homeless, degraded or regularly working lower layers of the proletariat is indeed a permanent feature of capitalism, including the capitalism of the welfare state. The truth is simply that in passages such as these Marx uses formulations that are ambiguous and so lend weight to confusion on the question. Does this mean that Marx did not formulate any theory of impoverishment of the working class, or that he made optimistic predictions about the general trend of working class conditions under capitalism? This would of course be a complete paradox, in the light of what he wrote in Chapter 25 of Capital Volume 1. The point to be made is simply that this chapter, like all of Marx's mature writings on this subject, is not concerned with movements of real wages at all, any more than the chapters on value are about movements of market prices of commodities other than the commodity labor power. This is clearly indicated in the very passage in question by Marx's statement that as capital accumulates the situation of workers becomes worse irrespective of whether their wages are high or low. 7. 2. What we in fact have here is a theory of a tendency towards relative impoverishment of the working class under capitalism in a 70. See below, Chapter 25, Section 4, pp. 797-8, 799, 71. See, for example, Michael Harrington's already classic The Other America, Harmondsworth, 1963, and the equivalent British study by Brian Abel Smith and Peter Townsend, The Poor and the Poorest, London, 1963, which estimates that 14% of the British population, 7 million people, were living in, or on the margin of, poverty 20 years after the establishment of the welfare state. To have revealed that such poverty is rooted in the system of wage labor, and that no permanent elimination of it, a guaranteed standard of living for all human beings, irrespective of how much they work or indeed whether they work at all, is possible without upsetting the economic compulsion to sell the proletarian's labor power, is one of Marx's most epoch-making discoveries and fundamental to his economic theory. 72. See below, page 799. 72. Introduction. Double sense. Firstly, in the sense that productive workers tend to get a smaller part of the new value they produce. In other words, there is a trend towards an increase in the rate of surplus value. Secondly, in the sense that even when wages rise, the needs of the workers as human beings are denied. This applies even to their additional consumer needs that grow out of the very increase in the productivity of labor which results from the accumulation of capital. One has only to think of the unfulfilled needs of workers in the fields of education, health, skill acquisition and differentiation, leisure, culture, housing, even in the richest capitalist countries of today, to see how this assumption remains accurate in spite of the so-called consumer society. But it applies much more to the needs of the worker as a producer and a citizen. His need to develop a full personality, to become a rich and creative human being, etc. These needs are brutally crushed by the tyranny of meaningless, mechanical, parcelized work, alienation of productive capacities and alienation of real human wealth. In addition to this law of general relative impoverishment of workers under capitalism, Marx also notes a trend towards periodic absolute impoverishment, essentially in function of the movement of unemployment. This is closely linked to the inevitability of cyclical fluctuations under capitalism, that is the inevitability of periodic crises of overproduction, or recessions, as they are called today with less provocative connotations. There is also another aspect of Marx's theory of wages over which, for almost a century, controversy has raged. This is the question of the different values of skilled labor power and unskilled labor power, whether related or not to the question of whether Marx gives a satisfactory explanation of the fact that, according to his labor theory of value, skilled labor produces more value in an hour of work than unskilled labor. Starting with Bohm-Bawerk, some critics have claimed to discover here one of the basic inconsistencies in Marx's economic theory. 7. 3. For if the greater productivity, in value terms, of skilled as opposed to unskilled workers is a function of the higher wages of the former, are we not back at Adam Smith's famous circular argument, in 73? For example, Bohm-Bawerk, Op. Cit. pp. 80-85, Pareto, Op. Cit. pp. 52-3, Schumpeter, Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy, page 24, etc. An interesting discussion of this problem was recently provided by Bob Rothorn, Skilled Labor in the Marxist System, in Bulletin of the Conference of Socialist Economists, Spring 1974. Introduction 73. Which the price of labor determines the natural price of goods but is in turn determined by the natural price of one category of goods, so-called wage goods, that is food. But in fact Marx avoided such circular reasoning, contrary to what his critics mistakenly assume. He never explained the higher value content of an hour of skilled labor as compared to an hour of unskilled labor by the higher wages which skilled labor receives. This higher content is explained strictly in terms of the labor theory of value, by the additional labor costs necessary for producing the skill, in which are also included the total costs of schooling spent on those who do not successfully conclude their studies. 74. The higher value produced by an hour of skilled labor, as compared to an hour of unskilled labor, results from the fact that skilled labor participates in the total labor power, Gesamtarbeitsvermögen, of society, or of a given branch of industry, not only with its own labor power but also with a fraction of the labor power necessary to produce its skill. In other words, each hour of skilled labor can be considered as an hour of unskilled labor multiplied by a coefficient dependent on this cost of schooling. 7. Marx speaks in this context of composite labor as against simple labor. The skill, by analogy, can be compared to an additional tool, which is in itself not value producing, but which transfers part of its own value into the value of the product produced by the skilled worker. 74. This solution was first formulated by Hilferding in his answer to Bohm-Bawerk, Op. Cit. pp. 136-46, then worked out more explicitly by Hans Deutsch, Quali, Isierte Arbeit und Kapitalismus, Vienna, 1904, and Otto Bauer, Qualifizierte Arbeit und Kapitalismus, in Die Neue Zeit, 1905-6, number 20. Deutsch differs from Hilferding in that according to Hilferding only the cost of production of skill, the work of the teacher, etc., adds to the value of skilled labor power, whereas for Deutsch the time spent by the apprentice, or student, himself while learning has to be added to those costs. Bauer supports Deutsch's thesis that the labor of the apprentice, student, creates supplementary value and enters the process of value production of the skilled worker, but contrary to Deutsch, and together with Hilferding, he contends that this value increases the surplus value produced by the skilled worker, not the value of his own labor power. See on this controversy also Rubin, Op. Cit. pp. 159-71, and Rostalski, Op. Cit. Volume 2, pp. 597-614, 7. S. Rubin, Op. Cit. pp. 165-6. 74. Introduction. 10. Marx's theory of money. Marx's attempt to formulate his own theory of money originates in a significant flaw in Ricardo's economic system. 76. While Ricardo adheres to a strict labor theory of value concerning commodities, he contends that this is true for gold only if the quantity in circulation remains in exact proportion to the mass and prices of other commodities. Increases or decreases in this money circulation would provoke an increase or decrease in commodity prices, and this in turn would provoke a further decrease or increase in the value of gold. Marx tries to overcome this inconsistency by integrating his theory of money into his general explanation of value, value production and autonomous value circulation, money circulation, capital circulation, on the basis of a rigorous application of the labor theory of value. As with the theory of value, the most important aspect of this monetary theory is the qualitative one, which has hitherto received too little attention from either the critics or the disciples of Marx. The fact that social labor, in a society based upon generalized commodity production, is fragmented into many segments of private labor executed independently of each other leads, as we have seen, to the result that its social character can only be recognized post festum, through the sale of the commodity and depending upon the amount of equivalent it receives in this sale. The social character of the labor embedded in the commodity, therefore, can only appear as a thing outside the commodity, that is, money. The fact that relations between human beings appear under capitalism, generalized commodity production, as relations between things, a phenomenon which Marx analyzed at length in the fourth section on the fetishism of the commodity of Chapter 1 of Capital Volume 1, CPP 163-77 below, should, therefore, not be understood in the sense that people under capitalism, being in the grip of false consciousness, have the illusion of being confronted with things when in reality they are confronted with specific social relations of production. It is also an objective necessity and compulsion. Under conditions of general JZED commodity production, social labor cannot be immediately recognized otherwise than through its exchange against money. The circulation of commodities cannot but produce its own 76. Karl Marx, A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, pp. 170-79. Introduction. 75. Counterpart in the circulation of the medium of exchange, money. 77. Money is the necessary materialization of abstract social labor. That is the qualitative determinant in Marxist monetary theory. It is by losing sight of this fundamental social nature of money, rooted in specific social relations of production, that so many authors, including Marxist ones, 78, have been tempted to give money, and money creation, functions which they cannot fulfill in a society based upon private property. To assume an automatic realization of the exchange value of commodities through the creation of an adequate volume of money presupposes that that value is pre-established, that all labor expended on the production of these commodities was socially necessary labor. In other words, it presupposes that there exists a permanent equilibrium of supply with effective demand and, therefore, that there is no commodity production at all but a priori adaptation of production to consciously registered needs. Under capitalism, including monopoly capitalism, this can never be achieved. Money born from the process of exchange, from the circulation of commodities, can realize the value of these commodities only because it itself has value, because it itself is a commodity produced by socially necessary abstract labor. Marx's theory of money is, therefore, above all a commodity theory of money in which the monetary standards, precious metals, enter the process of circulation with an intrinsic value of their own. From that point of view, Marx must reject any quantity theory of money applied to money. 77. See Marx's footnote at the beginning of chapter 3 on money, below, page 188. The question why money does not itself directly represent labor time, so that a piece of paper may represent, for instance, X hours labor, comes down simply to the question why, on the basis of commodity product tion, the products of labor must take the form of commodities. This is obvious, because their taking the form of commodities implies their differentiation into commodities, on the one hand, and the money commodity, on the other. It is also asked why private labor cannot be treated as its opposite, directly social labor. 78. For example, Hilferding's proposal, Das Finanzkapital, pp. 29-30, for a category called socially necessary value of circulation, Gesellschaftlich notwendiger Zirkulationswert, established by dividing the sum of values of all commodities by the velocity of circulation of money. Hilferding does not notice the incongruity of dividing quantities of value, i.e. socially necessary labor quanta, by the velocity of circulation media. Only prices, the monetary expression of value, can, of course, be so divided. Commodities cannot enter the circulation process except with preliminary prices. See a contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, pp. 66-8. 76 Introduction based upon a gold or gold and silver basis. When, with a given velocity of circulation, a given amount of gold has a value higher than that of the total mass of commodities against which it exchanges itself, it can no more lose value, that is, provoke an increase of prices through abundance of bullion, in the circulation process than any other commodity. What happens is simply that part of it will be withdrawn from circulation and hoarded, until such time as the need for circulation again increases. But if such a commodity theory of money implies a straight rejection of the quantity theory, as long as money is directly based upon precious metals, it points in the opposite direction as soon as we are faced with paper banknotes which function in reality as representatives of, and tokens for, precious metals. In this case, quite independently of whether or not there is legal convertibility of paper into gold, 79 emission of paper money to the amount which, at a given value of gold and a given velocity of circulation of the banknotes, enables it to realize the prices of all the commodities in circulation, will leave these prices unaffected. But if this amount of paper money in circulation is doubled at its face value, all other things remaining equal, prices expressed in that currency will also double, not in contradiction with, but in application of, the labor theory of value. To simplify, if we presume that each unit of gold circulates only once a year, the equation 1 million tons of steel equals 1,000 kilos of gold means that the same quantity of socially necessary abstract labor, say 100 million man-hours, has been necessary to produce the respective quantities of steel and gold. If 1,000 pounds, 000 represents 1,000 kilos of gold, then the fact that the price of 1 ton of steel is 1 pound is just a straight expression of the equality in value, in quantities of abstract labor, between 1 ton of steel and 1 kilo of gold. But if, through additional issuing of paper money, 1,000 kilos of gold is now represented by 2 million pounds instead of 1 million pounds, then, all other things remaining equal, the price of steel will rise from 1 pound to 2 pounds in strict application of the labor theory of value. This does not mean that, with regard to paper money, Marx was the proponent of any mechanistic quantity theory. There is an evident analogy between his theory and the traditional forms of 79. This was, for example, the case in France after its military defeat by Germany in 1870-71, when the payment of a heavy gold war indemnity to the Reich imposed a temporary suspension of convertibility of the franc without provoking any inflationary price movement in the Third Republic. Introduction 77 The quantity of money, but this analogy is limited by two essential factors. In the first place, for Marx, with paper money as with metallic money, it is the movement of the value of commodities, that is fluctuations of material production and of productivity of labor, which remains the primum movens of price fluctuations, not the ups and downs of the quantity of paper money in circulation. 80 In that respect, in Capital Volume 3, Marx examines the need to increase money circulation at the moment of the outbreak of the crisis, and he sharply criticizes the role which the Bank of England played, through the application of the currency principle, in accentuating money panics and monetary crises as accelerators of crises of overproduction when these coincided with an outflow of gold from England. In the same way, however, he denied any possibility of preventing recessions by issuing additional money. 81 In the second place, Marx understood perfectly that the dialectical interrelationship of all the elements of a mechanistic quantity theory equation excludes the possibility of simply deriving conclusions from independent variations of a single one of these elements. He knew, for example, that the velocity of circulation of money was co-determined by the trade cycle, and could not be considered stable in a given phase when only the quantity of money was supposed to change. But an analysis of his opinions on all these subjects as well as a short comment on his whole theory of the role of money in the trade cycle in a fictitious capital has its place in the introduction to Volume 3 rather than Volume 1 of Capital. With the development and generalization of commodity production, money becomes more and more transformed into money capital. It is more and more replaced by monetary signs in the process of circulation, and becomes more and more transformed from a means of exchange into a means of payment, that is into the counterpart of debts, into an instrument of credit. But in examining the credit role of money, Marx maintains a rigorous adherence to the labor theory of value, so that his whole economic system is thoroughly monistic. Money is the general equivalent of the 80. Except in cases of galloping inflation. 81. See Karl Marx, Capital, Volume 3, page 503. In the margin of the first edition of Capital Volume 1, Marx added a note to Chapter 3, converted by Engels in subsequent editions into a footnote, see below, page 236n, in which he indicated the distinction between monetary crises as expressions of general crises of overproduction, and autonomous monetary crises. 78 Introduction. Exchange value of all commodities and money is the means to settle debts, resulting out of the generalization of sales on credit, are both claims on a given fraction of the total labor expenditure of society in a given period. Whatever the nominal value of the currency, and whatever the standard of measurement of prices, it is obviously impossible to distribute more labor quantities than have been produced and stocked within the same period of time. On the other hand, given the very nature of commodity production, no general increase of money circulation, no increase of aggregate demand, can in the long run prevent the eventuality that a whole series of commodities produced will not meet the specific demand. They need to allow their proprietors to realize at least the average rate of profit. Technological changes, differences in productivity between different plants and firms, changes in real wages and in the structure of consumer expenditures, changes in the rate of profit entailing changes in the direction and structure of investment. All these complex movements which make the trade cycle and periodic recessions possible and indeed unavoidable under conditions of generalized commodity production cannot be eliminated by manipulation of currency volume or currency units. Experience since Marx's death, and especially since the Keynesian Revolution, fully confirms the correctness of this diagnosis, although it also confirms that, under specific conditions and within specific limits, monetary policies can reduce the amplitude of economic fluctuations, a fact of which Marx was perfectly aware. 82 Marx's short comments on the dual nature of gold, as the basis, in the last resort, of all paper money systems and as the only possible world currency, acceptable for final settlement of AC counts between the central banks and bourgeois classes of different nations, make especially interesting reading today, when the Bretton Woods monetary system has broken down because of the inconvertibility of the dollar into gold. It is interesting to note that Marx, while rejecting all theories which explain the value of money by convention or state compulsion, 83 does relate this role of gold as a means of final settlement of accounts on an international scale to the specific role of the bourgeois state. Among the functions of the state is that of creating the general conditions for capitalist production. A coherent and accepted currency. CER 82. Karl Marx, Capital, Volume 3, Chapter 34, especially page 539. 83. Karl Marx, Grundriss, page 165. A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, page 116. Introduction. 79 Toynley belongs to these general conditions. Paper money with a fixed rate of exchange, zwanskers, can be imposed only through the authority of the state within given limits. 84 But where this authority is absent, proprietors of commodities cannot be forced to accept in exchange for their goods paper money whose rate they consider inflated. Paper gold, as a universal means of exchange and payment on the world market presupposes, therefore, a world government, in other words the absence of inter-imperialist competition and, therefore, in the last analysis the withering away of private property. To expect such a situation to occur under capitalism is utopian. Marx's theory of money has been much less analyzed, criticized and discussed by later Marxists than other parts of his economic theory. 85 An interesting discussion did, however, occur on the eve of the First World War between Hilferding, Kautsky and Varga, on the possibility of deducing from the value of commodities a socially necessary volume of money, a hypothesis which is obviously mistaken since it confuses the value of commodities with their price. 86 Varga, moreover, in a series of polemics which were continued in the early 20s, persisted in maintaining that, as central banks bought gold at a fixed price, the fluctuations of the intrinsic value of gold would not influence the general level of prices, but only govern the ups and downs of the differential rent commanded by gold mines with a productivity above the level allowing the average rate of profit at the given price of gold. 87. Subsequent developments, especially in the last 4 or 5 years, have confirmed that both these attempted corrections of Marx's theory of money were unfounded and wrong. 84. Karl Marx, Grundriss, pp. 121-35. A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, pp. 116,119 to 22,149-53. 85. A rare exception is the book by Bruno Fritsch, Die Geld und Kredittheorie von Karl Marx, Frankfurt, 1968, which, although very critical, recognizes Marx's merit as the first real theoretician of credit. Much weaker was an earlier book by H. Bloch, Die Marxische Geldtheorie, Lena, 1926, 86. Karl Kautsky, Geld, Papier und Ware, in Die Neue Zeit, 1911-12, numbers 24, 25, 87. Eugen Varga, Goldproduktion und Teuerung, in Die Neue Zeit, 1911-12, I, number 7, and 1912-13, I, number 16. Rudolf Hilferding, Geld und Ware, Ibid. 1911-12, I, number 22. Karl Kautsky, Die Wandlungen der Goldproduktion und der wechselnde Charakter der Teuerung, Organsungschaft No. 16, Die Neue Zeit, 1912-13. Otto Bauer, Goldproduktion und Teuerung, Die Neue Zeit, 1912-13, 2, numbers 1 and 2. This discussion continued between Varga and E. Ludwig in 1923, in the theoretical organ of the KPD, Die Lnternat, Onali. 80 Introduction. 2. Kapital and the Destiny of Capitalism. It is above all through its integration of theory and history that Marxism manifests its superiority in the economic domain over classical and neoclassical political economy. It is through its ability to foresee correctly long-term trends of capitalist development, including the main inner contradictions of the capitalist mode of production which propel this long-term development forward, that capital continues to fascinate friend and foe alike. Those who, generation after generation, continue to accuse Marx of unscientific, party pre or speculative excursions into the realms of Prof. ECY 88 cannot escape the burden of proof. It is up to them to account for the mysterious fact that a thinker according to them so devoid of analytical tools should have been able unfailingly to work out the long-term laws of motion that have determined the development of capitalism for a century and a half. Apart from the so-called law of increasing absolute impoverishment of the working class wrongly attributed to Marx, the aspect of the latter's theoretical conclusions concerning the capitalist mode of production which has been most consistently under attack since Capital Volume 1 first appeared has been the so-called theory of the inevitable collapse of capitalism. Zusammenbruchs theory. First strongly challenged by the Bernsteinian revisionists within the socialist movement, and only weakly defended by most orthodox Marxists of the epoch, 89 the theory has been exposed to ridicule by a monotonous succession of authors in the last decades. All have asked the ritual rhetorical question: has not the capitalist mode of production shown a capacity of adaptation and self-reform far beyond anything which Marx foresaw? 9088. The most outstanding example is that of Popper, The Open Society and Its Enemies, Volume 2. See also, by the same author, Conjectures and Refutations, pp. 336-46, quoted above. 89. For Bernstein's questioning of the breakdown theory see, for example, Op. Cit. pp. 113-28. For a very mild reply see Heinrich Kuhnau, Zur Zusammenbruchstheorie, in Die Neue Zeit, 1898-9, I, pp. .424-30. In Das Finanzkapital Hilferding already raised the theoretical possibility of an organized capitalism without crises, through the operations of a general cartel, Op. Cit. Page 372, 90. See, for example, Tugan Baranovsky, Op. Cit. pp. 236-9, Schumpeter, Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy, page 42, Popper, The Open Society and Its Enemies, Volume 2, page 155 et al. C.A.R. Crossland, The Future of Socialism. Introduction. 81 Arguments along these lines usually contain a basic flaw: they try to prove too much. They contend that capitalism has survived so many crises that nobody can seriously challenge its capacity to survive future ones. But at the same time they also contend that the present economic system in the West cannot any longer be characterized as capitalist, and that through successive self-reform and adaptation, in order to overcome crises which threaten to wreck it, capitalism has transformed itself into a new social organization of the economy. This they most often characterize by the term mixed economy, although a host of other formulas such as managerial capitalism, organized capitalism, managerial society, technostructure rule, etc. have at times been devised to describe it. 91 But capital is not simply a powerful tool for understanding the great lines of world development since the Industrial Revolution. It also furnishes us with a clear and unequivocal definition of what the capitalist mode of production essentially represents. Capitalism is neither a society of perfect competition, nor a society of increasing pauperism, nor a society where private entrepreneurs rule the factories, nor even a society in which money is the one and only master. Vague and imprecise definitions of this type, which allow evasion of the basic issues, lead to endless confusion about the relationship of today's economic system in the West with the economic system analyzed by Capital. 92 Capital shows that the capitalist mode of production is fundamentally determined by London, 1956, pp. 3-5, etc. An interesting and voluminous anthology of texts related to the Zusammenbruchs theory has been published in Italy by Lucio Coletti and Claudio Napoleoni, Tu Futuro del Capitalismo, Crollo Zero Sviluppo. Bari, 1970. 91. It is impossible to list all the important authors who have evolved this type of analysis. It is sufficient to indicate the main trends: that of James Burnham's Managerial Revolution, that of the Social Democrats and Samuelson's Mixed Economy, C. Crossland, Op. Cit. pp. 29-35, that of Robin Morris's Managerial Capitalism, and that of Galbraith's Technostructure, the New Industrial State, which follows, perhaps unknowingly, the analysis of the German Social Democrat Richard Lowenthal, writing under the pen name Paul Sering, in Gensitz de Capita, Isthmus, Nuremberg, 1946, 92. Here a characteristic statement by Popper: how utterly absurd it is to identify the economic system of the modern democracies with the system Marx called capitalism, can be seen at a glance, by comparing it with his 10-point program for the communist revolution, in the Communist Manifesto of 1848, The Open Society and Its Enemies, Volume 2, page 129. 82 Introduction 3 Conditions and 3 only. 1. The fact that the mass of producers are not owners of the means of production in the economic sense of the word, but have to sell their labor power to the owners. 2. The fact that these owners are organized into separate firms which compete with each other for shares of the market on which commodities are sold, for profitable fields of investment for capital, for sources of raw materials, etc. That is, the institution of private property in the economic sense of the word. 3. The fact that these same owners of the means of production, different firms, are, therefore, compelled to extort the maximum surplus value from the producers, in order to accumulate more and more capital. Which leads, under conditions of generalized commodity production and generalized alienation, to constantly growing mechanization of labor, concentration and centralization of capital, growing organic composition of capital, the tendency for the rate of profit to fall, and periodically recurrent crises of overproduction. If these are the criteria, there can be no question that Western society is still capitalist, that wage labor and capital are still the two antagonistic classes of society, that accumulation of capital is more than ever the basic motive force of that society, and that the extortion and realization of private profit governs the basic drive of separate firms. Such aspects of contemporary Western society is the fact that some of these firms are nationalized, that there is growing state intervention in the economy, that competition has become, I am perfect, that it is no longer essentially fought by cutting prices, but rather by reducing production costs and increasing distribution and sales, that workers have strong trade unions, except when, under conditions of violent social crisis, bourgeois democratic freedoms are abolished, and that their standard of living has risen far more than Marx expected it to rise. All this in no way abolishes or reduces the relevance of the basic structural features of capitalism, as defined by capital, from which all the basic laws of motion of the system flow. These basic laws of motion thus continue to remain valid. Without courting paradox, one could even contend that, from a structural point of view, the concrete capitalism of the final quarter of the 20th century is much closer to the abstract model of capital than was the concrete capitalism of 1867, when Marx finished correcting the proofs of Volume 1. Firstly, because the intermediate class of small independent producers, proprietors, Introduction 83 of their own means of production, which was still a significant social layer a century ago, has today nearly been eroded out of existence. Dependent wage and salary earners, compelled to sell their labor power, now amount to over 80% of the economically active population in most Western countries and in several to over 90%. Secondly, because concentration and centralization of capital has led to a situation where not only do a couple of hundred giant corporations dominate the economy of each imperialist country, but a few hundred multinational corporations also concentrate in their hands 1/3 of all the wealth of the capitalist world economy. Thirdly, because the productivity and the objective socialization of labor have increased to such an extent that production of value for private enrichment has become absurd beyond anything Marx could have foreseen a century ago, and the world cries out so compellingly for a planned husbanding of resources to satisfy needs on the basis of consciously and democratically chosen priorities that even opponents of socialism cannot fail to understand the message. 9. 3. Why then, one might ask, have the expropriators not yet become the expropriated, and why does capitalism still survive in the highly industrialized countries? The answer to that question would involve a detailed critical review of 20th century political and social history. But the whole point is, of course, that Marx never predicted any sudden and automatic collapse of the capitalist system in one final crisis, due to a single economic cause. In the famous chapter 32 of Capital Volume 1, The Historical Tendency of Capitalist Accumulation, Marx describes economic tendencies provoking a reaction from social forces. The growth of the proletariat, of its exploitation, and of organized revolt against that exploitation, are the main levers for the overthrow of capitalism. Centralization of the means of production and objective socialization of labor create the economic preconditions for a society based upon collective property and free cooperation by associated producers. But they do not automatically produce such a society on some universal day of victory. They have to be consciously utilized, at privileged moments of social crisis, to bring about the revolutionary overthrow of the system. Marx was as far removed from any fatalistic belief in the automatic effects of economic determinism as any social thinker could. 93. See for example the reaction of scholars like Barry Commoner, The Closing Cycle, London, 1972, to the ecological crisis. 84 Introduction B. He repeated over and over again that men made and had to make their own history, only not in an arbitrary way and independently from the material conditions in which they found themselves. 94 Any theory of the collapse of capitalism, therefore, can only present itself as Marxist if it is a theory of conscious overthrow of capitalism, that is, a theory of socialist revolution. 95. Chapter 32, at the end of Capital Volume 1, only indicates in very general terms how and why objective inner contradictions of the capitalist mode of production make this overthrow both possible and necessary. The rest has to result, in Marx's words, from the growth of the revolt of the working class, a class constantly increasing in numbers, and trained, united and organized by the very mechanism of the capitalist process of production. In other words, between the growing economic contradictions of the capitalist mode of production on the one hand, and the collapse of capitalism on the other hand, there is a necessary mediation, the development of the class consciousness, organized strength and capacity for revolutionary action of the working class, including revolutionary leadership. That chapter of Marxist theory is not incorporated into Capital. Perhaps Marx intended to discuss it in the book on the state which he wanted to write but never came even to draft. At all events, he left no systematic exposition of his thought in this respect, although many ideas on the subject are to be found scattered throughout his articles and letters. It was up to his most gifted followers, foremost among them Lenin, Trotsky and Rosa Luxemburg, to deal systematically with what one might call the Marxist theory of the subjective factor. 94. C. For instance, the end of Marx's remarkable letter to Friedrich Bold of the 23rd of November 1871, Selected Correspondence, pp. 269-71, in which he explains the necessity for previous organization of the working class in order for it to be able to challenge the bourgeoisie for political power, and the fact that without such systematic education through propaganda, agitation and action, the working class remains a captive of bourgeois politics. 95. Rosa Luxemburg admirably synthesized the contradictory trends as early as 1899. The production relations of capitalist society approach more and more the production relations of socialist society. But on the other hand, its political and juridical relations, and, one might add, their ideological reflections in the minds of men as well, establish between capitalist society and socialist society a steadily rising wall. This wall is not overthrown but on the contrary strengthened and consolidated by the development of social reforms in the course of bourgeois parliamentary democracy, reform or revolution, in Mary Alice Waters, ed. Rosa Luxemburg Speaks, New York, 1970, page 57. Introduction 8s. The survival of capitalism to this day in the most industrialized countries has certainly given it a lifespan far beyond what Marx expected. But this is not because the system has developed in essentially other directions than those predicted by Capital. Nor is it because it has been able to avoid a periodic repetition of explosive social crises. On the contrary, since the Russian Revolution of 1905, and certainly since the outbreak of the First World War, such crises have become recurrent features of contemporary history. In the course of such crises, capitalism has indeed been overthrown in many countries, Russia and China being the most important. But contrary to what Marx expected, this overthrow occurred not so much where the proletariat was most strongly developed numerically and economically, as a result of the greatest possible extension of capitalist industry, that is, in those countries which also have a powerful bourgeois class. It occurred rather in those countries where the bourgeoisie was weakest and where, therefore, the political relationship of forces was favorable for a young proletariat capable of gaining the support of a strongly rebellious peasantry. This historical detour can be understood only if one integrates into the analysis two key factors. On the one hand, the development of imperialism and its effect on the large part of the human race which lives in socially and economically underdeveloped societies, the law of uneven and combined development. On the other hand, the interrelationship between the lack of revolutionary experience on the part of the Western working class during the long period of organic growth of imperialism, 1890 to 1914, and the growing reformism and integration of social democracy into bourgeois society and the bourgeois state which were responsible for the failure of the first large-scale revolutionary crises in the West, in 1918 to 23, above all in Germany and Italy. As a result of this failure, the victorious Russian Revolution itself became isolated, and the international working class movement went through the dark interlude of Stalinism, from which it only slowly began to emerge in the 1950s. This brings us back to what I have called the Marxist theory of the subjective factor, and incidentally explains why, after the rich flowering of Marxist economic theory in the period 1895 to 1930, a quarter of a century of almost total stagnation occurred in that field too. The debate around the Zusammenbruchs theory has suffered from a confusion between two different questions. The question 86 introduction, whether the replacement of capitalism by socialism is inevitable, an inevitable result of the inner economic contradictions of the capitalist mode of production, and the question whether, in the absence of a socialist revolution, capitalism would live on forever. A negative answer to the first question in no way implies a positive one to the second. Indeed, classical Marxists, following the young Marx, formulated their prognosis in the form of a dilemma: socialism or barbarism. The social catastrophes which mankind has witnessed since Auschwitz and Hiroshima indicate that there was nothing romantic in such a prognosis, but that it expressed a clear insight into the terrifying destructive potential of exchange value production, capital accumulation, and the struggle for personal enrichment as ends in themselves. The concrete mechanics of the economic breakdown of capitalist economy may be open to conjecture. The interrelationship of the downturn of value production, decline of the total number of labor hours produced as a result of semi-automation, of the increasing difficulty of realizing surplus value, of increasing output of waste not entering the reproduction process, of increasing depletion of national resources and, above all, of long-term decline of the rate of profit, is still far from clear. 96 But a very strong case can be made for the thesis that there are definite limits to the adaptability of capitalist relations of production, and that these limits are being progressively attained in one field after another. It is most unlikely that capitalism will survive another half-century of the crises, military, political, social, monetary, cultural, which have occurred uninterruptedly since 1914. It is most probable, moreover, that capital and what it stands for namely a scientific analysis of bourgeois society which represents the proletariat's class consciousness at its highest level, will in the end prove to have made a decisive contribution to capitalism's replacement by a classless society of associated producers. 96. I shall return to this whole subject, and especially to the relationship of the breakdown controversy to the tendency for the average rate of profit to decline, in the Introduction to Capital, Volume 3. Ernest Mandel. Translator's Preface. The original English translation of the first volume of Capital, by Samuel Moore and Edward A. Velling, was edited by Engels. His letters show that he took the task very seriously, and, as Marx's friend and collaborator for 40 years, he was certainly in a position to make the translation an authoritative presentation of Marx's thought in English. So why is a new translation necessary? Firstly, the English language itself has changed. A translation made in the 19th century can hardly survive this change intact. Think only of the pejorative sense the word laborer has taken on, making its replacement by worker essential. Secondly, Engels always tried to spare Marx's readers from grappling with difficult passages. In this, he was following his friend's example. In the postface to the French edition, written in 1875, Marx explains that he has revised the French text in order to make it more accessible to the reader, even though the rendering presented to him by Roy was scrupulously exact, referring in justification to the French public's impatience with theoretical discussion. In 1975, however, after the immense effort of critical investigation into Marxism made in the last few decades, and the publication of hitherto unavailable texts, it is no longer necessary greater than water down Capital in order to spare the reader, who was, in any case, generally put off by the bulk of the book rather than its difficulty. Hence whole sentences omitted by Engels can be restored, and theoretical difficulties, instead of being swept under the carpet, can be exposed to the daylight, insofar as the English language is capable of this. This comment relates above all to German philosophical terms, used repeatedly by Marx in Capital, as indeed elsewhere. In translating these, I have tried not to prejudge the philosophical questions, the question of Marx's relation to Hegel and that of the relation between his Philosophy 88 translator's preface and his political economy, but rather to present a text which would permit the reader to form his own view. Thirdly, it is generally agreed that Marx was a master of literary German. A translation which overlooks this will not do justice to his vivid use of the language and the startling and strong images which abound in Capital. In my translation, I have always tried to bear this element in mind. How successfully, the reader must judge. Ben Fowkes. NOTB. In compiling the editorial footnotes, indicated by asterisks etc., the translator has derived much assistance from the Marx-Engels work, Mew, edition of Capital. Preface to the first edition. This work, whose first volume 1 now submit to the public, forms the continuation of my book Zur Kritik der politischen Ökonomie, published in 1859. The long pause between the first part and the continuation is due to an illness of many years' duration, which interrupted my work again and again. The substance of that earlier work is summarized in the first chapter of this volume. This is done not merely for the sake of connectedness and completeness. The presentation is improved. As far as circumstances in any way permit, many points only hinted at in the earlier book are here worked out more fully, while, conversely, points worked out fully there are only touched upon in this volume. The sections on the history of the theories of value and of money are now, of course, left out altogether. However, the reader of the earlier work will find new sources relating to the history of those theories in the notes to the first chapter. Beginnings are always difficult in all sciences. The understanding of the first chapter, especially the section that contains the analysis of commodities, will therefore present the greatest difficulty. I have popularized the passages concerning the substance of value and the magnitude of value as much as possible. The 1. This is the more necessary, in that even the section of Ferdinand Lassalle's work against Schultz Delitzsch in which he professes to give the intellectual quintessence of my explanations on these matters contains important mistakes. If Ferdinand Lassalle has borrowed almost literally from my writings, and without any acknowledgement, all the general theoretical propositions in English translation, a contribution to the critique of political economy, Trail S.W. Ryazanskaya, London, 1971. The first chapter in the first edition. In subsequent editions this was expanded to 3 chapters, as in this edition. In this edition, numbered footnotes are Marx's own. Those marked by asterisks etc. are the translator's. 90. Preface to the first edition value form, whose fully developed shape is the money form, is very simple and slight in content. Nevertheless, the human mind has sought in vain for more than 2,000 years to get to the bottom of it, while on the other hand there has been at least an approximation to a successful analysis of forms which are much richer in content and more complex. Why? Because the complete body is easier to study than its cells. Moreover, in the analysis of economic forms neither microscopes nor chemical reagents are of assistance. The power of abstraction must replace both. But for bourgeois society, the commodity form of the product of labor, or the value form of the commodity, is the economic cell form. To the superficial observer, the analysis of these forms seems to turn upon minutiae. It does in fact deal with minutiae, but so similarly does microscopic anatomy. With the exception of the section on the form of value, therefore, this volume cannot stand accused on the score of difficulty. I assume, of course, a reader who is willing to learn something new and therefore to think for himself. The physicist either observes natural processes where they occur in their most significant form, and are least affected by disturbing influences, or, wherever possible, he makes experiments under conditions which ensure that the process will occur in its pure state. What I have to examine in this work is the capitalist mode of production, and the relations of production and forms of intercourse, verkehrsverhältnis, that correspond to it. Until now, their locus classicus has been England. This is the reason why England is used as the main illustration of the theoretical developments I make. If, however, the German reader pharisically shrugs his shoulders at the condition of the English industrial and agricultural workers, or optimistically comforts himself with the thought that in Germany things are not nearly so bad, I must plainly tell him, de te fabula narrator, * intrinsically, it is not a question of the higher or lower degree of his economic works, for example those on the historical character of capital, on the connection between the relations of production and the mode of production, etc., etc., even down to the terminology created by me. This may perhaps be due to purposes of propaganda. I am of course not speaking here of his detailed working out and application of these propositions, which I have nothing to do with. The tale is told of you, Horace, Satires, BKI, Satire 1. Preface to the first edition 91 Development of the social antagonisms that spring from the natural laws of capitalist production. It is a question of these laws themselves, of these tendencies winning their way through and working themselves out with iron necessity. The country that is more developed industrially only shows, to the less developed, the image of its own future. But in any case, and apart from all this, where capitalist production has made itself fully at home amongst us, for instance in the factories properly so called, the situation is much worse than in England, because the counterpoise of the factory acts is absent. In all other spheres, and just like the rest of continental Western Europe, we suffer not only from the development of capitalist production, but also from the incompleteness of that development. Alongside the modern evils, we are oppressed by a whole series of inherited evils, arising from the passive survival of archaic and outmoded modes of production, with their accompanying train of anachronistic social and political relations. We suffer not only from the living, but from the dead. La mort cécit i.e. vij. The social statistics of Germany and the rest of continental Western Europe are, in comparison with those of England, quite wretched. But they raise the veil just enough to let us catch a glimpse of the Medusa's head behind it. We should be appalled at our own circumstances if, as in England, our governments and parliaments periodically appointed commissions of inquiry into economic conditions, if these commissions were armed with the same plenary powers to get at the truth, if it were possible to find for this purpose men as competent, as free from partisanship and respective persons as are England's factory inspectors, her medical reporters on public health, her commissioners of inquiry into the exploitation of women and children, into conditions of housing and nourishment, and so on. Perseus wore a magic cap so that the monsters he hunted down might not see him. We draw the magic cap down over our own eyes and ears so as to deny that there are any monsters. Let us not deceive ourselves about this. Just as in the 18th century the American War of Independence sounded the tocsin for the European middle class, so in the 19th century the American Civil War did the same for the European working class. In England the process of transformation is palpably evident. When it has reached a certain point, it must react on the continent, i.e. amongst the Germans. The dead man clutches onto the living. Single quote. 92 Preface to the first edition. There it will take a form more brutal or more humane, according to the degree of development of the working class itself. Apart from any higher motives, then, the most basic interests of the present ruling classes dictate to them that they clear out of the way all the legally removable obstacles to the development of the working class. For this reason, among others, I have devoted a great deal of space in this volume to the history, the details, and the results of the English factory legislation. One nation can and should learn from others, even when a society has begun to track down the natural laws of its movement. And it is the ultimate aim of this work to reveal the economic law of motion of modern society. It can neither leap over the natural phases of its development nor remove them by decree. But it can shorten and lessen the birth pangs. To prevent possible misunderstandings, let me say this. I do not by any means depict the capitalist and the landowner in rosy colors. But individuals are dealt with here only in so far as they are the personifications of economic categories, the bearers, Träger, of particular class relations and interests. My standpoint, from which the development of the economic formation of society is viewed as a process of natural history, can less than any other make the individual responsible for relations whose creature he remains, socially speaking, however much he may subjectively raise himself above them. In the domain of political economy, free scientific inquiry does not merely meet the same enemies as in all other domains. The peculiar nature of the material it deals with summons into the fray on the opposing side the most violent, sordid and malignant passions of the human breast, the furies of private interest. The established church, for instance, will more readily pardon an attack on 38 of its 39 articles than on 1/39 of its income. Nowadays atheism itself is a culpa levis. As compared with the criticism of existing property relations. Nevertheless, even here there is an unmistakable advance. I refer, as an example, to the Blue Book published within the last few weeks. Correspondence with Her Majesty's missions abroad, regarding industrial questions and trades unions. There the representatives of the English crown in foreign countries declare in plain language that in Germany, in France, in short in all the civilized states of the European continent, a radical change in the existing relations. Single quote. Venial sin. Preface to the first edition 93 between capital and labor is as evident and inevitable as in Eng land. At the same time, on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, Mr. Wade, Vice President of the United States, has declared in public meetings that, after the abolition of slavery, a radical transformation in the existing relations of capital and landed property is on the agenda. These are signs of the times, not to be hidden by purple mantles or black cassocks. They do not signify that tomorrow a miracle will occur. They do show that, within the ruling classes themselves, the foreboding is emerging that the present society is no solid crystal, but an organism capable of change, and constantly engaged in a process of change. The second volume of this work will deal with the process of the circulation of capital, Book 2, and the various forms of the process of capital in its totality, Book 3, while the third and last volume, Book 4, will deal with the history of the theory. 3. I welcome every opinion based on scientific criticism. As to the prejudices of so-called public opinion, to which I have never made concessions, now, as ever, my maxim is that of the great Florentine. Segui il tuo corso, e lascia dir I gente. T. Karl Marx, London, the 25th of July 1867. Books 2 and 3 were issued by Engels after Marx's death as separate volumes, and are referred to below as volumes 2 and 3, as they are generally known. This would have made Book 4 Volume 4, but the manuscript for this was eventually published by Kautsky as Theories of Surplus Value. Go on your way, and let the people talk. Marx altered Dante's words to make them fit in here. The original is: Vien retro a me, e lascia dir I gente, follow me, and let the people talk, in div. Na comd. A. Purgator. O. Canto V. Line 13. Postface to the second edition. I must start by informing the readers of the first edition about the alterations made in the second edition. The clearer arrangement of the book will be immediately apparent. Additional notes are everywhere marked as notes to the second edition. The following are the most important points with regard to the text itself. In Chapter 1, Section 1, the derivation of value by analysis of the equations in which every exchange value is expressed has been carried out with greater scientific strictness. Similarly, the connection between the substance of value and the determination of the magnitude of value by the labor time socially necessary, which was only alluded to in the first edition, is now expressly emphasized. Chapter 1, Section 3, on the form of value, has been completely revised, a task which was made necessary by the twofold presentation of it in the first edition, if by nothing else. Let me remark in passing that this twofold presentation was occasioned by my friend Dr. L. Kugelmann, in Hanover. I was visiting him in the spring of 1867 when the first proof sheets arrived from Hamburg, and he convinced me that most readers needed a supplementary, more didactic exposition of the form of value. The last section of the first chapter, the fetishism of commodities, etc., has been altered considerably. Chapter 3, Section 1, on the measure of values, has been carefully revised, because in the first edition this section was treated carelessly, the reader having been referred to the explanation already given in Zur Kritik der politischen Ökonomie, Berlin, 1859. Chapter 7, particularly Section 2, has been reworked to a great extent. It would be pointless to go into all the partial textual changes, which are often purely stylistic. They occur throughout the book. Nevertheless, I find now, on revising the French translation which is appearing in Paris, that several parts of the German original postface to the second edition 95 stand in need of a rather thorough reworking, while other parts require rather heavy stylistic editing, and still others require the painstaking elimination of occasional slips. But there was no time for that. For I was informed only in the autumn of 1871, when in the midst of other urgent work, that the book was sold out and the printing of the second edition was to begin in January 1872. The appreciation which Das Kapital rapidly gained in wide circles of the German working class is the best reward for my lab ars. A man who in economic matters represents the bourgeois standpoint, the Viennese manufacturer Herr Mayer, in a pamphlet published during the Franco-German War, aptly expounded the idea that the great capacity for theory, which used to be considered a hereditary German attribute, had almost completely disappeared amongst the so-called educated classes in Germany, but that amongst the working class, on the contrary, it was enjoying a revival. Political economy remains a foreign science in Germany, up to this very moment. In his Geschichtliche Darstellung des Handels, der Gewerbe, USW. T. especially in the first two volumes, published in 1830, Gustav von Gillich has already examined, for the most part, the historical circumstances that prevented the development of the capitalist mode of production in Germany, and consequently the construction there of modern bourgeois society. Thus the living soil from which political economy springs was absent. It had to be imported from England and France as a ready-made article. Its German professors always remained pupils. The theoretical expression of an alien reality turned in their hands into a collection of dogmas, interpreted by them in the sense of the petty bourgeois world surrounding them, and therefore misinterpreted. The feeling of scientific impotence, a feeling which could not entirely be suppressed, and the uneasy awareness that they had to master an area in fact entirely foreign to them, was only imperfectly concealed beneath a parade of literary and historical erudition, or by an admixture of extraneous material borrowed from the so-called cameral sciences, a medley of smatterings through whose pure. Sigmund Mayer, Die Soziale Frage in Wien, Vienna, 1871. T. Historical Description of Commerce, Industry, etc., S. Vols. Jena, 1830-45. Kameralwissenschaft, or Cameralism, was the German version of mercantilism. It tended to see political economy in narrow terms as a matter of finance and administration, since it arose as a set of ideas as to how the rulers of German princely states could use their revenues to promote the state's well-being. Notable Cameralists were von Horneck in the 17th and Justi in the 18th century. 96 postface to the second edition. Guattari, the hopeful candidate for the German bureaucracy, has to pass. Since 1848, capitalist production has developed rapidly in Germany, and at the present time it is in the full bloom of speculation and swindling. But fate is still unpropitious to our pro-phase sciential economists. At the time when they were able to deal with political economy in an unprejudiced way, modern economic conditions were absent from the reality of Germany. And as soon as these conditions did come into existence, it was under circumstances that no longer permitted their impartial investigation within the bounds of the bourgeois horizon. In so far as political economy is bourgeois, i.e. in so far as it views the capitalist order as the absolute and ultimate form of social production, instead of as a historically transient stage of development, it can only rattle in a science while the class struggle remains latent or manifests itself only in isolated and sporadic phenomena. Let us take England. Its classical political economy belongs to a period in which the class struggle was as yet undeveloped. Its last great representative, Ricardo, ultimately, and consciously, made the antagonism of class interests, of wages and profits, of profits and rent, the starting point of his investigations, naively taking this antagonism for a social law of nature. But with this contribution the bourgeois science of economics had reached the limits beyond which it could not pass. Already in Ricardo's lifetime, and in opposition to him, it was met by criticism in the person of Sismondi. 1. The succeeding period, from 1820 to 1830, was notable in England for the lively scientific activity which took place in the field of political economy. It was the period of both the vulgarizing and the extending of Ricardo's theory, and of the contest of that theory with the old school. Splendid tournaments were held. What was achieved at that time is little known on the European continent, because the polemic is for the most part scattered over articles in reviews, pieces d'occasion and pamphlets. The unprejudiced character of this polemic, although Ricardo's theory already serves, in exceptional cases, as a weapon with which to attack the bourgeois economic system, is explained by the circumstances of the time. On the one hand, large-scale industry itself. 1. See my work Zur Kritik der Politischen Ökonomie, page 39, English translation, page 61. Postface to the second edition 97 was only just emerging from its childhood, as is shown by the fact that the periodic cycle of its modern life opens for the first time with the crisis of 1825. On the other hand, the class struggle between capital and labor was forced into the background, politic ally by the discord between the governments and the feudal aristocracy gathered around the Holy Alliance, assembled in one camp, and the mass of the people, led by the bourgeoisie, in the other camp, and economically by the quarrel between industrial capital and aristocratic landed property. This latter quarrel was concealed in France by the antagonism between small-scale, fragmented property and big landownership, but in England it broke out openly after the passing of the Corn Laws. The literature of political economy in England at this time calls to mind the economic storm and stress period, which in France followed the death of Dr. Quesnay, but only as an Indian summer reminds us of spring. With the year 1830 there came the crisis which was to be decisive, once and for all. In France and England the bourgeoisie had conquered political power. From that time on, the class struggle took on more and more explicit and threatening forms, both in practice and in theory. It sounded the knell of scientific bourgeois economics. It was thenceforth no longer a question whether this or that theorem was true, but whether it was useful to capital or harmful, expedient or inexpedient, in accordance with police regulations or contrary to them. In place of disinterested inquirers there stepped hired prizefighters, in place of genuine scientific research, the bad conscience and evil intent of apologetics. Still, even the important 8 pamphlets with which the Anti-Corn Law League, led by the manufacturers Cobden and Bright, deluged the world offer a historical interest, if no scientific one, on account of their polemic against the landed aristocracy. But since then the free trade legislation inaugurated by Sir Robert Peel has deprived vulgar economics even of this, its last sting. The Continental Revolution of 1848 also had its reaction in Dr. Quesnay died in 1774. His death was immediately followed by Turgot's attempt to put physiocratic ideas into practice, while he was Louis XVI's Controller General, 1774-6. His fall in 1776 opened a period of political and economic crisis which culminated in the French Revolution. It is this which Marx has in mind, rather than the, somewhat exiguous, theoretical writings of the period after 1774. 98 postface to the second edition England. Men who still claimed some scientific standing and aspired to be something more than mere sophists and sycophants of the ruling classes tried to harmonize the political economy of capital with the claims, no longer to be ignored, of the proletariat. Hence a shallow syncretism, of which John Stuart Mill is the best representative. This is a declaration of bankruptcy by bourgeois economics, an event already illuminated in a masterly manner by the great Russian scholar and critic N. Chemyshevsky in his Outlines of Political Economy according to Mill. In Germany, therefore, the capitalist mode of production came to maturity after its antagonistic character had already been revealed, with much sound and fury, by the historical struggles which took place in France and England. Moreover, the German proletariat had in the meantime already attained a far clearer theoretical awareness than the German bourgeoisie. Thus, at the very moment when a bourgeois science of political economy at last seemed possible in Germany, it had in reality again become impossible. Under these circumstances, its spokesmen divided into two groups. The one set, prudent, practical business folk, locked to the banner of Bastiat, the most superficial and therefore the most successful representative of apologetic vulgar economics. The other set, proud of the professorial dignity of their science, full-load John Stuart Mill in his attempt to reconcile the irreconcilable. Just as in the classical period of bourgeois economics, so also in the period of its decline, the Germans remained mere pupils, imitators and followers, petty retailers and hawkers in the service of the great foreign wholesale concern. The peculiar historical development of German society therefore excluded any original development of bourgeois economics there, but did not exclude its critique. In so far as such a critique represents a class, it can only represent the class whose historical task is the overthrow of the capitalist mode of production and the final abolition of all classes. The proletariat. The learned and unlearned spokesmen of the German bourgeoisie tried at first to kill Das Kapital with silence, a technique which had succeeded with my earlier writings. As soon as they found that these tactics no longer fitted the conditions of the time, they wrote prescriptions for tranquilizing the bourgeois mind, on the pretext of criticizing my book. But they found in the work Urs Press. See for example Joseph Dietzgen's articles in the postface to the second edition 99 Volksstaat. Champions stronger than themselves, to whom they still owe a reply even now. 2. An excellent Russian translation of Capital appeared in the spring of 1872 in St. Petersburg. The edition of 3,000 copies is already nearly exhausted. As early as 1871, N. Sieber, professor of political economy in the University of Kiev, in his work David Ricardo's Theory of Value and of Capital, referred to my theory of value, money and capital as in its fundamentals a necessary sequel to the teaching of Smith and Ricardo. What astonishes a Western European when he reads this solid piece of work is the author's consistent and firm grasp of the purely theoretical position. That the method employed in Capital has been little understood is shown by the various mutually contradictory conceptions that have been formed of it. Thus the Paris Review positivist it reproaches me for, on the one hand, treating economics metaphysically, and, on the other hand, imagine this. Confining myself merely to the critical analysis of the actual facts, instead of writing recipes, Comtist ones, for the cookshops of the future. Professor Sieber has already given the answer to the reproach about metaphysics, in so far as it deals too. The mealy-mouthed babblers of German vulgar economics grumbled about the style of my book. No one can feel the literary shortcomings of Capital more strongly than I myself. Yet I will quote in this connection one English and one Russian notice, for the benefit and enjoyment of these gentlemen and their public. The Saturday Review, an entirely hostile journal, said in its notice of the first edition, the presentation of the subject invests the driest economic questions with a certain peculiar charm. The St. Petersburg Journal, Sankt Peterburgsky Vedomosti, in its issue of the 20th April 1872, says, the presentation of the subject, with the exception of one or two excessively specialized parts, is distinguished by its comprehensibility to the general reader, its clearness, and, in spite of the high scientific level of the questions discussed, by an unusual liveliness. In this respect the author in no way resembles the majority of German scholars, who write their books in a language so dry and obscure that the heads of ordinary mortals are cracked by it. Dietzgen's articles on Capital Aktuelle appeared in No. 31, 34, 35 and 36 of the Demokratisches Wochenblatt in 1868. After the founding Congress of the German Social Democratic Workers' Party in 1869, the paper was made its official organ, and renamed Der Volksstaat. La Philosophie Positive. Review was the journal of the followers of Auguste Comte. It appeared in Paris between 1867 and 1883, under the editorship of Littré. 100 Post, Ace to the second edition with actual theory. The method of Marx is the deductive method of the whole English school, a school whose failings and virtues are common to the best theoretical economists. Mr. M. Bloch. In As Theoriciens du Socia, Ismi and Ella Magna. Extrait du Journal des Economistes, Gillet et Ou 1872. Makes the discovery that my method is analytic, and says, with this work, M. Marx can be ranged among the most eminent analytical thinkers. The German reviewers, of course, cry out against my Hegelian sophistry. The European Messenger, Vyesnik Evropy, of St. Petersburg, in an article dealing exclusively with the method of Capital, May 1872 issue, pp. 427-36, finds my method of inquiry severely realistic, but my method of presentation, unfortunately, German dialectical. It says, at first sight, if the judgment is made on the basis of the external form of the presentation, Marx is the most idealist of philosophers, and indeed in the German, i.e. the bad sense of the word. But in point of fact he is infinitely more realistic than all his predecessors in the business of economic criticism. He can in no sense be called an idealist. I cannot answer the writer of this review in any better way than by quoting a few extracts from his own criticism, which may, apart from this, interest some of my readers for whom the Russian original is inaccessible. After a quotation from the preface to my Zur Kritik der Politischen Ökonomie, Berlin, 1850, page IVV, where I have discussed the materialist basis of my method, the reviewer goes on. The one thing which is important for Marx is to find the law of the phenomena with whose investigation he is concerned, and it is not only the law which governs these phenomena, insofar as they have a definite form and mutual connection within a given historical period, that is important to him. Of still greater importance to him is the law of their variation, of their development, of their transition from one form into another, from one series of connections into a different one. Once he has discovered this law, he investigates in detail the effects with which it manifests itself in social life. Consequently, Marx only concerns himself with one thing: to show, by an exact scientific investigation, the necessity of successive determinate orders of social relations, and to establish, as impeccably as possible, the facts from which he starts out in *1. I. Kaufmann, 1848–1916, Russian economist, professor of political economy at the University of St. Petersburg, and author of numerous works on money and credit. English translation, pp. 19–23. Postface to the second edition 101 on which he depends. For this it is quite enough, if he proves, at the same time, both the necessity of the present order of things, and the necessity of another order into which the first must inevitably pass over, and it is a matter of indifference whether men believe or do not believe it, whether they are conscious of it or not. Marx treats the social movement as a process of natural history, governed by laws not only independent of human will, consciousness and intelligence, but rather, on the contrary, determining that will, consciousness and intelligence. If the conscious element plays such a subordinate part in the history of civilization, it is self-evident that a critique whose object is civilization itself can, less than anything else, have for its basis any form or any result of consciousness. This means that it is not the idea but only its external manifestation which can serve as the starting point. A critique of this kind will confine itself to the confrontation and comparison of a fact, not with ideas, but with another fact. The only things of importance for this inquiry are that the facts be investigated as accurately as possible, and that they actually form different aspects of development vis-a-vis each other. But most important of all is the precise analysis of the series of successions, of the sequences and links within which the different stages of development present themselves. It will be said, against this, that the general laws of economic life are one and the same, no matter whether they are applied to the present or the past. But this is exactly what Marx denies. According to him, such abstract laws do not exist. On the contrary, in his opinion, every historical period possesses its own laws. As soon as life has passed through a given period of development, and is passing over from one given stage to another, it begins to be subject also to other laws. In short, economic life offers us a phenomenon analogous to the history of evolution in other branches of biology. The old economists misunderstood the nature of economic laws when they likened them to the laws of physics and chemistry. A more thorough analysis of the phenomena shows that social organisms differ among themselves as fundamentally as plants or animals. Indeed, one and the same phenomenon falls under quite different laws in consequence of the different general structure of these organisms, the variations of their individual organs, and the different conditions in which those organs function. Marx denies, for example, that the law of population is the same at all times and in all places. He asserts, on the contrary, that every stage of the 102 postface to the second edition development has its own law of population. With the varying degrees of development of productive power, social conditions and the laws governing them vary too. While Marx sets himself the task of following and explaining the capitalist economic order from this point of view, he is only formulating, in a strictly scientific manner, the aim that every accurate investigation into economic life must have. The scientific value of such an inquiry lies in the illumination of the special laws that regulate the origin, existence, development and death of a given social organism and its replacement by another, higher one. And in fact, this is the value of Marx's book. Here the reviewer pictures what he takes to be my own actual method, in a striking and, as far as concerns my own application of it, generous way. But what else is he depicting but the dialectical method? Of course the method of presentation must differ in form from that of inquiry. The latter has to appropriate the material in detail, to analyze its different forms of development and to track down their interconnection. Only after this work has been done can the real movement be appropriately presented. If this is done successfully, if the life of the subject matter is now reflected back in the ideas, then it may appear as if we have before us an a priori construction. My dialectical method is, in its foundations, not only different from the Hegelian, but exactly opposite it. For Hegel, the process of thinking, which he even transforms into an independent subject, under the name of the idea, is the creator of the real world, and the real world is only the external appearance of the idea. With me, the reverse is true. The ideal is nothing but the material world reflected in the mind of man, and translated into forms of thought. I criticized the mystificatory side of the Hegelian dialectic nearly 30 years ago, at a time when it was still the fashion. But just when I was working at the first volume of Capital, the ill-humored, arrogant and mediocre epigones who now talk large in educated German circles began to take pleasure in treating Hegel in the same way as the good Moses Mendelssohn treated Spinoza in Lessing's time, namely as a dead dog. I therefore openly. Moses Mendelssohn, 1729–86, was a philosopher who popularized the ideas of the Enlightenment in Germany, and a friend of Lessing. Marx refers here to Mendelssohn's controversy with Jacobi over the alleged Spinozism of Postface to the second edition 103 avowed myself the pupil of that mighty thinker, and even, here and there in the chapter on the theory of value, coquetted with a mode of expression peculiar to him. The mystification which the dialectic suffers in Hegel's hands by no means prevents him from being the first to present its general forms of motion in a comprehensive and conscious manner. With him it is standing on its head. It must be inverted, in order to discover the rational kernel within the mystical shell. In its mystified form, the dialectic became the fashion in Germany, because it seemed to transfigure and glorify what exists. In its rational form it is a scandal and an abomination to the bourgeoisie and its doctrinaire spokesmen, because it includes in its positive understanding of what exists a simultaneous recognition of its negation, its inevitable destruction, because it regards every historically developed form as being in a fluid state, in motion, and therefore grasps its transient aspect as well, and because it does not let itself be impressed by anything, being in its very essence critical and revolutionary. The fact that the movement of capitalist society is full of contradictions impresses itself most strikingly on the practical bourgeois and the changes of the periodic cycle through which modern industry passes, the summit of which is the general crisis. That crisis is once again approaching, although as yet it is only in its preliminary stages, and by the universality of its field of action and the intensity of its impact it will drum dialectics even into the heads of the upstarts in charge of the new Holy Prussian German Empire. Karl Marx, London, the 24th of January 1873. Lessing. In the pamphlet, Moses Mendelssohn to the Friends of Lessing, 1786, he defends the latter against this accusation, and the related one of atheism. Preface to the French edition. To Citizen Maurice Lechatre. Dear Citizen, I applaud your idea of publishing the translation of Capital as a serial. In this form the book will be more accessible to the working class, a consideration which to me outweighs everything else. That is the good side of your suggestion, but here is the reverse of the medal. The method of analysis which I have employed, and which had not previously been applied to economic subjects, makes the reading of the first chapters rather arduous, and it is to be feared that the French public, always impatient to come to a conclusion, eager to know the connection between general principles and the immediate questions that have aroused their passions, may be disheartened because they will be unable to move on at once. That is a disadvantage I am powerless to overcome, unless it be by forewarning and forearming those readers who zealously seek the truth. There is no royal road to science, and only those who do not dread the fatiguing climb of its steep paths have a chance of gaining its luminous summits. Believe me, dear citizen, your devoted, Karl Marx. London, the 18th of March 1872. Postface to the French edition. To the reader, Mr. J. Roy set himself the task of producing a version that would be as exact and even literal as possible, and has scrupulously fulfilled it. But his very scrupulousness has compelled me to modify his text, with a view to rendering it more intelligible to the reader. These alterations, introduced from day to day, as the book was published in parts, were not made with equal care and were bound to result in a lack of harmony in style. Having once undertaken this work of revision, I was led to apply it also to the basic original text, the second German edition, to simplify some arguments, to complete others, to give additional historical or statistical material, to add critical suggestions, etc. Hence, whatever the literary defects of this French edition may be, it possesses a scientific value independent of the original and should be consulted even by readers familiar with German. Below I give the passages in the postface to the second JN edition which treat of the development of political economy in Germany and the method employed in the present work. Karl Marx, London, the 28th of April 1875. See above, pp. 95–103. Preface to the third edition. Marx was not destined to get this, the third edition, ready for the press himself. The powerful thinker, to whose greatness even his opponents now make obeisance, died on the 14th of March 1883. Upon me who, in Marx, lost the best, the truest friend I had. And had for 40 years. The friend to whom I am more indebted than can be expressed in words. Upon me now devolved the duty of attending to the publication of this third edition, as well as of the second volume, which Marx had left behind in manuscript. I must now account here to the reader for the way in which I discharged the first part of my duty. It was Marx's original intention to rewrite a great part of the text of the first volume, to formulate many theoretical points more exactly, to insert new ones, and to bring historical and statistical materials up to date. But his ailing condition and the urgent need to do the final editing of the second volume induced him to give up this scheme. Only the most necessary alterations were to be made, only the insertions which the French edition, La Capitale, par Karl Marx, Paris, Lacter, 1873 t. Already contained were to be put in. Among the books left by Marx there was a German copy which he himself had corrected here and there and provided with references to the French edition. Also a French copy in which he had indicated the exact passages to be used. These alterations and additions are confined, with few exceptions, to Part 7 of the book, entitled, The Process of Accumulation of Capital. Here the previous text followed the original draft more closely than elsewhere, while the preceding sections had been gone over more thoroughly. The style was therefore more vivacious, more of a single cast, but also more careless, studded with anglicisms and. See above, page 93, first note. The French edition appeared in installments between 1872 and 1875. Preface to the third edition 107 in parts unclear. There were gaps here and there in the presentation of arguments, some important particulars being merely alluded to. With regard to the style, Marx had himself thoroughly revised several subsections and had thereby indicated to me here, as well as in numerous oral suggestions, the length to which I could go in eliminating English technical terms and other anglicisms. Marx would in any event have gone over the additions and supplementary texts and have replaced the smooth French with his own terse German. I had to be satisfied, when transferring them, with bringing them into maximum harmony with the original text. Thus not a single word was changed in this third edition without my firm conviction that the author would have altered it himself. It would never occur to me to introduce into capital the current jargon in which German economists are wont to express themselves. That gibberish in which, for instance, one who has others give him their labor for cash is called a laborgiver, Arbeitgeber, and one whose labor is taken away from him for wages is called a labortaker, Arbeitnehmer. In French, too, the word travail is used in everyday life in the sense of occupation. But the French would rightly consider any economist crazy hold he call the capitalist a donneur de travail, laborgiver, or the worker a receiver de travail, labortaker. Nor have I taken the liberty of converting the English coins and money, weights and measures used throughout the text into their new German equivalents. When the first edition appeared there were as many kinds of weights and measures in Germany as there are days in the year. Apart from this, there were two kinds of mark. The Reichsmark only existed at the time in the imagination of Soetbeer, who had invented it in the late 30s. Two kinds of guilder, and at least three kinds of thaler, including one called the Neues Zweidrittel. In the natural sciences the metric system prevailed, in the world market. English weights and measures. Under such circumstances, English units of measurement were quite natural for a book which had to take its factual proofs almost exclusively from the conditions prevailing in English industry. The last named reason is decisive even today, especially as the corresponding conditions in the world market have hardly. New 2/3. A silver coin worth T of a thaler, which circulated in a number of German principalities between the 17th and the 19th centuries. 108 Preface to the third edition changed and English weights and measures almost entirely predominate, particularly in the key industries, iron and cotton. In conclusion, a few words on Marx's manner of quoting, which is so little understood. When they are pure statements of fact or descriptions, the quotations, from the English Blue Books, for example, serve of course as simple documentary proof. But this is not so when the theoretical views of other economists are cited. Here the quotation is intended merely to state where, when and by whom an economic idea conceived in the course of development was first clearly enunciated. Here the only consideration is that the economic conception in question must be of some significance to the history of the science, that it is the more or less adequate theoretical expression of the economic situation of its time. But whether this conception still possesses any absolute or relative validity from the standpoint of the author or whether it has already become wholly past history is quite immaterial. Hence these quotations are only a running commentary to the text, a commentary borrowed from the history of economic science. They establish the dates and originators of certain of the more important advances in economic theory. And that was a very necessary thing in a science whose historians have so far distinguished themselves only by the tendentious ignorance characteristic of place hunters. It will now be understood why Marx, in consonance with the postface to the second edition, only had occasion to quote German economists in very exceptional cases. There is hope that the second volume will appear in the course of 1884. Frederick Engels, London, the 7th of November 1883. Preface to the English edition. The publication of an English version of Das Kapital needs no apology. On the contrary, an explanation might be expected why this English version has been delayed until now, seeing that for some years past the theories advocated in this book have been constantly referred to, attacked and defended, interpreted and misinterpreted, in the periodical press and the current literature of both England and America. When, soon after the author's death in 1883, it became evident that an English edition of the work was really required, Mr. Samuel Moore, for many years a friend of Marx and of the present writer, and than whom, perhaps, no one is more conversant with the book itself, consented to undertake the translation which the literary executors of Marx were anxious to lay before the public. It was understood that I should compare the MS with the original work, and suggest such alterations as I might deem advisable. When, by and by, it was found that Mr. Moore's professional occupations prevented him from finishing the translation as quickly as we all desired, we gladly accepted Dr. Aveling's offer to undertake a portion of the work. At the same time Mrs. Aveling, Marx's youngest daughter, offered to check the quotations and to restore the original text of the numerous passages taken from English authors and blue books and translated by Marx into German. This has been done throughout, with but a few unavoidable exceptions. The following portions of the book have been translated by Dr. Aveling. 1. Chapters 10, The Working Day, and 11, Rate and Mass of Surplus Value. 2. Part 6, Wages, comprising chapters 19 to 22. 3. From Chapter 24, Section 4, Circumstances which, etc., to the end of the book, comprising the latter part of Chapter 24, Chapter 25, and the whole of Part 8, Chapters 26,110. Preface to the English edition to 33. 4. The two authors' prefaces. All the rest of the book has been done by Mr. Moore. While, thus, each of the translators is responsible for his share of the work only, I bear a joint responsibility for the whole. The third German edition, which has been made the basis of our work throughout, was prepared by me, in 1883, with the assistance of notes left by the author, indicating the passages of the second edition to be replaced by designated passages from the French text published in 1873. 1. The alterations thus effected in the text of the second edition generally coincided with changes prescribed by Marx in a set of MS instructions for an English translation that was planned, about 10 years ago, in America, but abandoned chiefly for want of a fit and proper translator. This MS was placed at our disposal by our old friend Mr. F. A. Sorge of Hoboken. NJ designates some further interpolations from the French edition. But, being so many years older than the final instructions for the third edition, I did not consider myself at liberty to make use of it otherwise than sparingly, and chiefly in cases where it helped us over difficulties. In the same way, the French text has been referred to in most of the difficult passages, as an indicator of what the author himself was prepared to sacrifice wherever something of the full import of the original had to be sacrificed in the rendering. 1. Le Capital, par Karl Marx. Traduction de M. J. Roy. Entirement révisé par l'auteur, Paris, Le Châtre. This translation, especially in the latter part of the book, contains considerable alterations in and additions to the text of the second German edition. For the English edition of Capital, Engels changed Marx's earlier division of the book into chapters and parts, making the 3 sections of what was Chapter 4 and the 7 sections of what was Chapter 24 into separate chapters. For reasons of convenience to English readers, we have held to Engels's arrangement. We have also followed Engels in presenting the chapters on so-called primitive accumulation as a separate Part 8, which is certainly justifiable in view of its special subject matter. The following table shows the relation between parts and chapters in English and German editions. German. English chapters 1 to 3. 1, 3, 4. 4, 6, 5, 2, 3. 7, 2, 5, 2, 4. 2, 6, 3, 2, 2, 5. 33 parts. 1, 6. 1, 6, 7. 7, 8. Preface to the English edition 111. There is, however, one difficulty we could not spare the reader. The use of certain terms in a sense different from what they have, not only in common life, but in ordinary political economy. But this was unavoidable. Every new aspect of a science involves a revolution in the technical terms of that science. This is best shown by chemistry, where the whole of the terminology is radically changed about once in 20 years, and where you will hardly find a single organic compound that has not gone through a whole series of different names. Political economy has generally been content to take, just as they were, the terms of commercial and industrial life, and to operate with them, entirely failing to see that by so doing it confined itself within the narrow circle of ideas expressed by those terms. Thus, though perfectly aware that both profits and rent are but subdivisions, fragments of that unpaid part of the product which the laborer has to supply to his employer, its first appropriator, though not its ultimate exclusive owner, yet even classical political economy never went beyond the received notions of profits and rents, never examined this unpaid part of the product, called by Marx surplus product, in its integrity as a whole, and therefore never arrived at a clear comprehension, either of its origin and nature, or of the laws that regulate the subsequent distribution of its value. Similarly, all industry, not agricultural or handicraft, is indiscriminately comprised in the term of manufacture, and thereby the distinction is obliterated between two great and essentially different periods of economic history: the period of manufacture proper, based on the division of manual labor, and the period of modern industry based on machinery. It is, however, self-evident that a theory which views modern capitalist production as a mere passing stage in the economic history of mankind, must make use of terms different from those habitual to writers who joke upon that form of production as imperishable and final. A word respecting the author's method of quoting may not be out of place. In the majority of cases, the quotations serve, in the usual way, as documentary evidence in support of assertions made in the text. But in many instances, passages from economic writers are quoted in order to indicate when, where and by whom a certain proposition was for the first time clearly enunciated. This is done in cases where the proposition quoted is of importance as being a more or less adequate expression of the conditions of social production and exchange prevalent at the time, and 112 preface to the English edition quite irrespective of Marx's recognition, or otherwise, of its general validity. These quotations, therefore, supplement the text by a running commentary taken from the history of the science. Our translation comprises the first book of the work only. But this first book is in a great measure a whole in itself, and has for 20 years ranked as an independent work. The second book, edited in German by me in 1885, as decidedly incomplete without the third, which cannot be published before the end of 1887. When Book 3 has been brought out in the original German, it will then be soon enough to think about preparing an English edition of both. Capital is often called, on the continent, the Bible of the working class. That the conclusions arrived at in this work are daily more and more becoming the fundamental principles of the great working class movement, not only in Germany and Switzerland, but in France, in Holland and Belgium, in America, and even in Italy and Spain, that everywhere the working class more and more recognizes, in these conclusions, the most adequate expression of its condition and of its aspirations, nobody acquainted with that movement will deny. And in England, too, the theories of Marx, even at this moment, exercise a powerful influence upon the socialist movement which is spreading in the ranks of cold turd people no less than in those of the working class. But that is not all. The time is rapidly approaching when a thorough examination of England's economic position will impose itself as an irresistible national necessity. The working of the industrial system of this country, impossible without a constant and rapid extension of production, and therefore of markets, is coming to a dead stop. Free trade has exhausted its resources. Even Manchester doubts this its quondam economic gospel. 2. Foreign industry, rapidly developing, stares English production in the face everywhere, not only in protected, but also in neutral markets, and even on this side of the Channel. While the productive power increases in a geometric ratio, the extension of markets proceeds at 2. At the quarterly meeting of the Manchester Chamber of Commerce, held this afternoon, a warm discussion took place on the subject of free trade. A resolution was moved to the effect that, having waited in vain 40 years for other nations to follow the free trade example of England, this chamber thinks the time has now arrived to reconsider that position. The resolution was rejected by a majority of one only, the figures being 21 for, and 22 against, Evening Standard, the 1st of November 1886. Preface to the English edition 113 best in an arithmetic 1. The decennial cycle of stagnation, prosperity, overproduction and crisis, ever recurrent from 1825 to 1867, seems indeed to have run its course, but only to land us in the slough of despond of a permanent and chronic depression. The sighed for period of prosperity will not come. As often as we seem to perceive its heralding symptoms, so often do they again vanish into air. Meanwhile, each succeeding winter brings up afresh the great question, what to do with the unemployed? But while the number of the unemployed keeps swelling from year to year, there is nobody to answer that question, and we can almost calculate the moment when the unemployed, losing patience, will take their own fate into their own hands. Surely, at such a moment, the voice ought to be heard of a man whose whole theory is the result of a lifelong study of the economic history and condition of England, and whom that study led to the conclusion that, at least in Europe, England is the only country where the inevitable social revolution might be effected entirely by peaceful and legal means. He certainly never forgot to add that he hardly expected the English ruling classes to submit, without a pro-slavery rebellion, to this peaceful and legal revolution. Frederick Engels, the 5th of November 1886. This is Marx's and Engels' usual description of the American Civil War of 1861 to 1865, which was set off by the revolt of the slave owners of the Southern states. Preface to the 4th edition. The 4th edition required that I should establish in final form, as nearly as possible, both text and footnotes. The following brief explanation will show how I have fulfilled this task. After again comparing the French edition and Marx's manuscript remarks, I have made some further additions to the German text from that translation. They will be found on page 212, pp. 624-6, pp.730-4, pp.777-80 and on page 783 in note 13. I have also followed the example of the French and English editions by putting the long footnote on the minors into the text, pp. 626-34. Other small alterations are of a purely technical nature. Further, I have added a few more explanatory notes, especially where changed historical conditions seem to demand this. All these additional notes are enclosed in square brackets and marked either with my initials or DHT. In the meantime, a complete revision of the numerous quotations had been made necessary by the publication of the English edition. For this edition, Marx's youngest daughter, Eleanor, undertook to compare all the quotations with their originals, so that those taken from English sources, which constitute the vast majority, are given there not as retranslations from the German but in the original English form. In preparing the 4th edition, it was therefore incumbent upon me to consult this text. The comparison revealed various small inaccuracies, page numbers wrongly indicated, owing partly to mistakes in copying from notebooks, and partly to the accumulated misprints of 3 editions, misplaced quotation or omission marks, which cannot be avoided when a mass of quotations is copied from notebook. The page numbers in the present edition have been inserted in place of Engels' references to the 3rd and 4th German editions. T. der Herausgeber, Le. The editor. In this edition, all of Engels' editions are integrated into the text but indicated as such. Preface to the 4th edition 115 extracts. Here and there some rather unhappy translation of a word. Particular passages quoted from the old Paris notebooks of 1843-5, when Marx did not know English and was reading English economists in French translations, so that the double translation yielded a slightly different shade of meaning, as in the case of Stuart, Ewer, etc., where the English text had now to be used. And other similar instances of trifling inaccuracy or negligence. But anyone who compares the fourth edition with the previous ones can convince himself that all this laborious process of emendation has not produced the smallest change in the book worth speaking of. There was only one quotation which could not be traced. The one from Richard Jones, page 746, note 35. Marx probably slipped up when writing down the title of the book. All the other quotations retain their cogency in full, or have had their cogency enhanced by being put into their present exact form. Here, however, I am obliged to revert to an old story. I know of only one case in which the accuracy of a quotation given by Marx has been called in question. But as the issue dragged on beyond his lifetime, I cannot well ignore it here. On the 7th of March 1872 there appeared in the Berlin Concordia, the organ of the Association of German Manufacturers, an anonymous article entitled, How Karl Marx Quotes. It was asserted there, with an excessive display of moral indignation and unparliamentary language, that the quotation from Gladstone's budget speech of the 16th April 1863, in the inaugural address of the International Working Men's Association, 1864, T.N. repeated in capital, Volume 1, pp. 805-6, had been falsified, that not a single word of the sentence, this intoxicating augmentation of wealth and power is entirely confined to classes of property, was to be found in the semi-official, stenographic report in Hansard. But this sentence is nowhere to be found in Gladstone's speech. Exactly the opposite is stated there. In bold type, his sentence, both in form and substance, is a lie inserted by Marx. Marx, to whom this issue of Concordia was sent the following May, answered the anonymous author in the Volksstadt of one this quotation was in fact later successfully traced. Crossing below, page 746, last note. T.C. Karl Marx, The First International and After, Pelican Marx Library, 1974, page 75. 116 Preface to the 4th edition June. As he could not recall which newspaper report he had used for the quotation, he limited himself to citing, first the equivalent quotation from 2 English publications, and then the report in the Times, according to which Gladstone says, that is the state of the case as regards the wealth of this country. I must say for one, I should look almost with apprehension and pain upon this intoxicating augmentation of wealth and power, if it were my belief that it was confined to classes who are in easy circumstances. This takes no cognizance at all of the condition of the laboring population. The augmentation I have described and which is founded, I think, upon accurate returns, is an augmentation entirely confined to classes possessed of property. Thus Gladstone says here that he would be sorry if this were so, but it is so. This intoxicating augmentation of wealth and power is entirely confined to classes of property. And, as for the semi-official Hansard, Marx goes on to say, in the version he manipulated afterwards, Mr. Gladstone was astute enough to obliterate this passage, which, coming from an English Chancellor of the Exchequer, was certainly compromising. This, by the way, is a traditional custom in the English Parliament, and not an invention got up by little Lasker against Bebel. The anonymous writer gets angrier and angrier. In his rejoinder, in the Concordia of the 4th of July, he sweeps aside second-hand sources and demurely suggests that it is the custom to quote parliamentary speeches from the stenographic report, adding, however, that the report in the Times, which includes the falsified sentence, and the report in Hansard, which omits it, are substantially in complete agreement, and also that the report in the Times contains the exact opposite to that notorious passage in the inaugural address. The fellow carefully conceals the fact that the report in the Times explicitly includes that self-same, notorious passage, side by side with its alleged opposite. Despite all this, however, the anonymous writer feels that he is stuck fast and that he can only save himself by some new dodge. Thus, although his article bristles, as we have just shown, with impudent mendacity, and is asterisk in the Reichstag sitting of the 8th of November 1871, the National Liberal deputy Lasker declared in the course of a speech against the Social Democrat Bebel that if the German workers tried to follow the example of the Paris Commune, the honest, propertied citizens would beat them to death with cudgels. But in the stenographic report he had the words, beat them to death with cudgels replaced with, hold them down with their own strength. Bebel immediately revealed that this was a falsification. Preface to the 4th edition 117 interlarded with such edifying terms of abuse as bad faith, dishonesty, lying allegation, that spurious quotation, impudent mendacity, a quotation entirely falsified, this falsification, simply infamous, etc., he finds it necessary to divert the issue to another domain, and therefore promises to explain in a second article the meaning which we, the non-mendacious anonymous one, attribute to the content of Gladstone's words. As if his particular opinion, unauthoritative as it is, had anything whatever to do with the matter. This second article was printed in the Concordia of the 11th of July. Marx replied again in the Volksstadt of the 7th of August, now giving in addition the reports of the passage in question from the Morning Star and Morning Advertiser of the 17th April 1863. According to both reports, Gladstone said that he would look with apprehension, etc. upon this intoxicating augmentation of wealth and power if he believed it to be confined to classes in easy circumstances. But this augmentation was in fact, he said, entirely confined to classes possessed of property. So these reports too reproduced word for word the sentence alleged to have been lyingly inserted. Marx further established once more, by comparing the texts in the Times and in Hansard, that this sentence, which 3 newspaper reports of identical content, appearing independently of one another the next morning, proved to have been really ut-terd, was missing from the Hansard report, revised according to the familiar custom, and that Gladstone, to use Marx's words, had afterwards conjured it away. In conclusion, Marx stated that he had no time to enter into any further discussions with the anonymous one. The latter also seems to have had enough. At any rate, Marx received no further issues of Concordia. With this, the matter appeared to be dead and buried. True, once or twice later on there reached us, from persons in touch with the University of Cambridge, mysterious rumors of an unspeakable literary crime which Marx was supposed to have committed in capital, but despite all investigation nothing more definite could be learned. Then, on the 29th of November 1883, 8 months after Marx's death, there appeared in the Times a letter headed Trinity College, Cambridge, and signed Sedley Taylor, in which this little man, who dabbles in the mildest sort of cooperative activities, seized upon some chance pretext or other to Sedley Taylor, 1834 to 1920, T. Fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge, and author of a book entitled Profit Sharing Between Capital and Labor, 1884. 118 Preface to the 4th edition enlighten us at last, not only about those vague Cambridge rumors, but also about the anonymous fellow in the Concordia. What appears extremely singular, says the little man from Trinity College, is that it was reserved for Professor Brentano, then of the University of Breslau, now of that of Strasbourg, to expose the bad faith which had manifestly dictated the citation made from Mr. Gladstone's speech in the inaugural address. Herr Karl Marx, who attempted to defend the citation, had the hardihood, in the deadly shifts to which Brentano's masterly conduct of the attack speedily reduced him, to assert that Mr. Gladstone had manipulated the report of his speech in the Times of the 17th April 1863, before it appeared in Hansard, in order to obliterate a passage which was certainly compromising for an English Chancellor of the Exchequer. On Brentano's showing, by a detailed comparison of texts, that the reports of the Times and of Hansard agreed in utterly excluding the meaning which craftily isolated quotation had put upon Mr. Gladstone's words, Marx withdrew from further controversy under the plea of want of time. Single quote.